I wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Grace Shemaine. I go by she, her. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Texas. The League never supports or opposes political parties or political candidates. Our mission is empowering voters and defending democracy. Thank you so much for attending the 2021 League of Women Voters of Texas Lobby Day event. I hope you are inspired to take action with the League during this important 87th Texas legislative session. League members are like the U.S. Postal Service. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their imported rounds. Not even COVID-19 pandemic has stopped our leagues across Texas from registering voters, educating voters, and engaging voters in all corners of Texas. If you are not a league member, I hope you will join us. We welcome people 16 and older of all gender identities to join the league. Our panelists will present to you valuable information about advocating for voting rights, for a fair and open redistricting process, and how you can be an effective advocate at the Texas Capitol. We encourage you to submit questions by using the Q&A button on your screens. We will answer as many questions as time allows. We will also provide a link to resources after the webinar. Before we begin, let's do a quick poll for our participants. Please enter your answer for who is on the webinar. Just give you a few minutes, just a few seconds to do that. Just mark those two questions. Then I'll tell you what the results are. I'm so happy you're here today. It's kind of a rainy, mucky day, but at least it's not as cold as it is up north. Okay, let's see what the answers are. Looks like 73% are league members, 14% from another organization, 10% are just advocates. We're welcoming you here. A few elected officials or staff and others. And we have a lot of people from North Texas. 25% from South Texas, East Texas is 14%, and West Texas is 3%, Central Texas is 28%. Welcome everybody. And now we're going to have Stephanie Swanson, who is the League of Women Voters of Texas issue chair for redistricting. Stephanie?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I have the esteemed pleasure of welcoming Michael Lee. When Grace and I were talking about who to invite today to talk on redistricting, the first person obviously that I thought of was Michael Lee, because the Brennan Center is such a cornerstone for a lot of the work that we do. And I know last session when a lot of us were walking the halls up at the Capitol, we would also take the Brennan Center's resources with us, because when we walked into legislators' offices and you had that information in hand, they would perk up and listen. So I'm so happy that he could join us today. I'm going to quickly give a little bit of a background info. Michael Lee serves as the senior counsel for the Brennan Center's democracy program, where his work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Michael Lee practiced at Baker Law Botts LLP in Dallas. So he's from Texas, you guys, for 10 years. He was the author of a widely cited blog on redistricting and election law issues that the New York Times called indispensable. He is also a regular writer and commentator on election law issues, appearing on PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, and NPR, and in print in the New York Times, LA Times, USA Today, Roll Call Box. You get the picture, I think. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm only sad that I couldn't be there in person, but maybe next decade we can do that, or the pandemic ends before redistricting is over, because one thing that's certain about redistricting in Texas is that it will end up in the courts and that there may be multiple rounds. But I'm going to share my screen and give hopefully this will work. You would think after 9 months of doing this in the pandemic, I would have this down flat, but I don't quite. Let me see. Hopefully that works. Does that work? Good. Okay. So I'm going to give a little bit of landscape about what's different this cycle in redistricting and layer in some national insights so that people have a sense of sort of what's going on nationally, but with this particular focus on Texas. And every redistricting cycle is tough. It's fast paced. You're trying to juggle a million things all at once, and before you know it, it's gone. I oftentimes compare it to the Olympics. You do things that you only do once every 10 years, and then it's really fast. You're trying to accomplish everything all at once. But let's start a little bit with one of the big things that's going to be different this cycle, which is let me see, get here. That redistricting will be later than it normally is. Normally, redistricting would take place in this legislative session of the Texas legislature. Sometimes it would roll over into a special session in the summer. But this cycle, redistricting is going to be much later than that. And that is because data from the census, the 2020 census, has been delayed. Normally, there are two sets of data. Normally, we would have already gotten the first set of data, which would have been the total population of the state without any demographic or regional breakdown, and the number of seats that Texas would have in the U.S. House of Representatives. That data has been delayed until at least April 30th, 2021, and the Census Bureau has said it could come out even later than that, which, as you'll note, is almost the end of the legislative session in Texas. But the second set of data is a more important set of data because that's the block level population data and also the demographic data that you need to draw maps. And that traditionally would come in mid-February to March of this year. Texas is one of the earliest states to get it because it redistricts in its legislative session in 2021. And so Texas normally would get it, in about 10 days or so. But instead, this year it's been delayed until at least July 31st, and many people are saying it could be August or even September before the states get the data. And then it's important to note that once the states get the data, that data will have to be processed to match it up with precincts and things like that. And that process typically takes a few weeks, maybe a little bit more than a month to do. So really, you're not looking for redistricting till September at the earliest, and potentially a little later than that, which in Texas means that redistricting will take place in a special session of the legislature, the timing of which will be controlled by the governor. And that is, the special sessions in Texas are limited to 30 days, where the governor can call multiple special sessions. But, that presents the possibility that, of some gaming of the process because you won't know exactly when redistricting will take place. Which is not to say that there isn't a lot of stuff going on already and stuff that people can be doing, but the actual passage of the maps will likely be in the fall. So a quick overview about what's happened in Texas since 2010, and starting with the U.S. As you can see here, the U.S. Has grown, but at a much slower pace than it has any time since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And that's there are a number of factors involved there. One is slowing immigration, particularly in the later part of last decade, but also the country is growing older and there are fewer people being added with births. So the US overall added about 22.5 million people, but the growth rate was only about 8%, remarkably slow. And as you can see, the projections are the US will grow even slower in the next 2 decades as the country ages. But that 22.5 million people were not evenly spread out. And as most Texans probably know instinctively, Texas has been growing really fast. In fact, Texas added about 4.4 million people, assuming the census numbers come out as we think they will, which is more than 35 other states. And really the the states powering the country's growth this decade have been California and then the states of the South, but with Texas far in the lead. It probably will not surprise people to learn that most of Texas's population growth was Latino, but the state also had very strong growth in its Black populations and also its Asian populations. And the Asian population actually grew the fastest as a percentage because the Asian population is the smallest. So the almost 600,000 Asians added are huge, on a percentage basis. The white population in Texas also grew, but not by nearly as much. And so 90% of Texas's population gain last decade approximately came from communities of color, and only about 10% came from the state's white population. Now, where does that growth come from? Most of the growth in Texas comes from births. Texas is one of the younger states in the country. Only Utah has a lower median age than Texas. So most of Texas's growth is just from people having babies. Texas also is a big source of international migration. And it has some migration from elsewhere in the country, but not nearly as much as most Texans think. Most Texans tend to think that the growth in the state comes from people moving to Texas because Texas is a economically hospitable place. And there's some of that, but really the biggest thing is births. And it is, to give a sense of like what Texas looks like demographically by age, as you'll see, older Texans are disproportionately overwhelmingly white. There aren't really a lot of people of color in older ranges, but younger Texans are disproportionately not white. And this will play out in the state's politics in the coming decade. Now, very quickly, comparing this to the nation also sees something similar, like strong Latino growth, strong Asian growth, Black growth, but really, in contrast to Texas, where the white population did continue to grow, in the nation as a whole, the white population was more or less flat. And this is our projection. Other people have run the numbers and projected actually that the census will show that the white population of the country actually fell last decade for the very first time in the country's history. So it's either flat, a little bit of growth, or it's fallen. This, of course, has will play out in the reallocation of congressional seats. The Northeast and the Midwest continue to lose seats. The states of the West and the South are gaining. Texas will be the big winner with 3 new seats if everything turns out with the census. California, for the very first time, will lose a seat in the whole, ever since it's become a state, it's never lost a seat. It will lose a seat for the very first time. But Texas and Florida are the big winners. And that will play into redistricting because the redistricting spoils are huge. And just very quickly, you'll see here, looking over the course of a decade, Texas and New York basically since 1970 have flipped positions. Florida also has overtaken New York, or will overtake New York this decade in terms of its congressional representation. And so, this is a long-term trend. Now, the legal landscape is a little bit ominous, and it's ominous in part for one reason, which is, well, one of the big factors that plays into the legal landscape is that maps in Texas will be drawn under single party control, just as they were in 2011. And single party control is a recipe for redistricting abuses, whether it's Democrats in control or Republicans in control. Political considerations oftentimes will be first and foremost. But complicating that in Texas will be the fact that for the very first time since the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Texas will not be required to submit its maps for pre-approval by the Justice Department or by a 3-judge panel in Washington, unless, and that's because the Supreme Court struck down that requirement and said the states that were required to do that, the formula for looking at that was outdated. Congress could reenact a new formula. It hasn't done so yet. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But right now, it looks like Texas will not be required to get its maps pre-approved, and that's big. So because what pre-approval meant is that you had to show the maps were not intentionally discriminatory and that you didn't reduce the ability to elect of communities of color. And that was key because it protected, you know, emerging power. So if a community of color developed an ability to elect, that was protected, you know, but it's also huge because the burden was on the state. The state couldn't use the map until it got it pre-approved. And now what groups have to do is they have to run into court to try to get an injunction and block a map. So the burden is on groups like MALDEF and you know the league and others to run into court and say this map violates law. And unless they get a judge to say I agree, you know the state can go ahead and use the map. And you see how this played out last decade when Texas was required to get its maps pre-approved. Texas decided to go to a 3-judge panel in Washington, in part because they didn't trust the Obama Justice Department. The 3-judge panel ended up issuing a long, almost 200-page ruling. This is one key footnote there, where it said that the group's challenge, arguing that the Texas map should not be approved, provided more evidence of discriminatory intent than we have space or need to address here, right? And so Texas was blocked from using its maps last decade because of Section 5. It will not be. There will not be Section 5 this decade unless Congress changes that. Another big change is that the Supreme Court has said that partisan gerrymandering is okay. And that is huge. It wasn't clear before, and many people acted like, you know, it was okay. But now the Supreme Court has said you can partisan gerrymander, and that you can't challenge that in federal court, and that is huge. These are some of the states that we think are going to be at highest risk for gerrymandering, and invariably it will be people of color who are used to gerrymander because, you know, there still aren't, for the most part, outside of like places like Austin, like that many white Democrats, and the white Democrats tend to live close to white Republicans, sometimes in the same house, and so gerrymandering white Republicans means like drawing a line down somebody's bed in some cases. Which is really hard to do. So it's much easier to target communities of color, which tend to be Democratic communities. And so we expect to see a lot of that this decade. So should people, what does that mean? You know, are we in a abandon all hope sort of world? And the answer to that is no. This is Princess Leia from Rogue One when she receives the plans to the Death Star, and they ask her, like, what does this mean? And she says, hope. And I'll tell you 3 or so reasons why I think that there is still opportunity in Texas. One is Texas is, as we saw, is a very fast growing state. It's demographically changing at a really fast clip. It's also politically changing. You've seen shifts in the suburbs among white voters, particularly white women in the suburbs. And so that creates a lot of risk for Republicans. You know, it's one thing to gerrymander in a state that isn't growing very fast because you draw the maps and you're done, right? Ohio is a relatively stable, static state, right? Texas is hard, you know, because the essence of a gerrymander is that you don't draw districts that your party wins by 80%. If you do that, you're using your voters inefficiently. What you want to do is you want to spread your voters out among a lot of districts so that you win a lot of districts by, say, 53%. And that's the essence of an aggressive gerrymander. But the problem in a state that changes as much as Texas, demographically and politically, and that just frankly is growing really fast, is that by the end of the decade, you might lose some of those 53% seats. And so there's going to be a trade-off for Republicans about whether they want to be greedy and get the most seats that they can possibly get, or they want to draw safer seats. And that provides some opportunity. So for example, this is Austin. You can see Travis County there in the middle. The city of Austin is divided among 6 different congressional districts. Travis County is divided among 5. And you could see like the amount of territory of Texas that is required to basically neutralize Austin, right? You know, Austin is this like thing that like Republicans don't like. They don't like Lloyd Doggett in particular, and the amount of territory that is required to somehow neutralize Austin, to find enough voters to like neutralize Austin, is huge, right? And so there's some thought in many quarters that it would be better for Republicans to create an Austin-based district, pack as many Democrats as they can in that district, and just say you get one and the other seats that are out there will be safer, because a lot of these seats were competitive last cycle. Democrats didn't win any of them, but if they left this structure in place, they might in the future. So there's some self-preservative interest for Republicans that is a dynamic this cycle. Also, there still is the Voting Rights Act. There's Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which in certain cases requires the creation of majority districts or majority minority districts. And, you know, there are opportunities. This is Dallas-Fort Worth, but there are certainly other areas where you could argue for creation of new opportunity districts. And that's going to be a big play. Now that will come in advocacy, and it also will come in litigation. Also, there is something called racial gerrymandering, which we talked about. Most people, when they think about racial gerrymandering, they think about race discrimination. Racial gerrymandering, actually, in the legal sense, is a colorblind theory. It basically says you can't draw districts predominantly on the basis of race, right? Because we're supposed to be a colorblind society. And no, discriminatory intent is not required. And racial gerrymandering started off as a claim for white voters to challenge VRA districts, but now it's increasingly being used by communities of color, including in North Carolina, where you see the first congressional district, which has all these arms coming out, which were basically designed to suck as many Black voters into the district as possible. The Supreme Court struck that down and said, you were just like looking for Black voters. These people have nothing in common other than the fact that they're Black. That's unconstitutional. And helpfully, Justice Kagan, in a footnote, a lot of legal stuff goes on in footnotes, said that even if you're trying to do this for political reasons, you can't use race as a means to achieve a political effect, and that's potentially big in Texas, right? You can't use race as a means for getting to where you want to be, and the big challenge in Texas is going to be protecting. You saw in Texas last couple cycles, like the emergence of potentially really powerful multiracial coalitions in places like the Texas 22nd district, that's Sri Kulkarni on the left and Candice Valenzuela from North Texas on the right, who almost won. I mean, they came really close, right? And if we were going to continue using the same maps for another 5 years or a decade, it's likely that you would see communities of color start to win races in places like that. But there will be an effort by Republicans to kneecap that emerging power in the suburbs, right? And it's important to understand that most people of color now actually live in the suburbs, right? We think of people of color as being in the cities or perhaps in rural areas like South Texas, but really the majority of Latinos, the majority of Black Americans, the majority of Asian Americans who live in the metro areas now live in the suburbs, right? And that is where the future of political power is in a lot of ways. I'll talk briefly about the importance of community testimony. It may seem hopeless in Texas, but the reality is that community testimony is really important for level setting. It's important for driving the narrative so that reporters don't talk about this as an inside the dome D's versus R's issue, that they understand what's happening to communities. And it's also important for litigation. And you saw this come up in places like California, where you had a district created around wildfires, right? Where people said we're split up among different areas in the LA foothills. We'd like the LA foothills kept in one district so that somebody in Sacramento is caring about wildfires. The commission there agreed to do that. But even in litigation, a lot of times community testimony, community mapping, submission of alternatives plays a role. So in Virginia, the Virginia legislature tried to invent a map saying we were just trying to keep counties together. And, yes, the map has a bias, but, we were just trying to keep counties together, and it just happened. There's no way to do it without creating bias. It turns out that there was a map drawn in a student competition where the student split fewer counties and actually it doesn't have bias. So there are lots of ways that this plays out, and, engagement in the process helps the media tell a better story. It helps courts understand what's going on, and helps color that. I will end just by saying there is a wild card in all of this, which is Congress. There are potential federal reforms, including HR 1, which likely will move in the next month or so. It would ban partisan gerrymandering by statute. It would set uniform national rules for map drawing. It eventually will require independent commissions. It's not clear if that's still possible this decade. There's also an effort to renew the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by adopting a new coverage formula, which would cover, among other states, Texas. It's unclear the time frame on which that needs to move. But of course, in all of this, a big question is whether we're in a 51 vote world or a 60 vote world, and to say, which is to say whether you need to get, you can pass it on Democratic lines or whether you need to pick up effectively 10 Republicans. And so we don't know that. This is Joe Manchin. If you don't recognize him on the right, that's Lady Gaga on the left. I don't know Joe Manchin at all, but if anybody does and knows what he's thinking about the filibuster, I'd love to know that. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Michael. That was
I'll stop. I will stop sharing.
I think we're going to go to questions now.
Yes, we have quite a few. The first one is, with COVID and other issues, do you think the information gathered is sufficient to provide realistic data for redistricting, or is there a possibility of redoing it?
The census I don't think you can redo the census, right? You know, the census takes 10 years. It is like a hugely expensive, complicated thing. And so there really isn't the ability to redo the census, unfortunately. And we don't know whether the data will be bad and how bad it will be. We'll get some sense in April when the apportionment numbers come out. But even then, the numbers may look good for the state. Like, oh yeah, this seems about like what we thought Texas would have. But they could be like really devastating at the block level. So it would be hard to draw a Latino district in parts of Houston, for example. And so we don't know. And so I think a lot of people are thinking about like whether you could fix the data in some way. But you know, it really isn't possible to redo the census just because that is such a cumbersome. It takes a lot of planning. They literally hire hundreds of thousands of people to help knock on doors, and you can't repeat that. So.
Okay. The next question, if North Carolina wasn't allowed to draw lines to just capture Black voters, does that mean Texas can't do the same to capture white voters?
Well, you can't draw a district predominantly on the basis of race. The challenge this decade, and I mentioned Justice Kagan's explanation there, right? Is that you have to come up with a different reason, right? So if Texas is trying to pack white voters into a district, and it's not clear that it benefits Republicans overall, because there aren't, again, like in Travis County, Democrats get about half the white vote. Everywhere else in Texas is under 30%, or just add 30%. I think it's 35% in Dallas County. It really, in some ways, it's not clear that they want to draw like white sort of districts in most places, right? And they would probably have different explanations. I do think that one thing that is going to happen last decade, a lot of the packing was justified on the basis of trying to comply with the Voting Rights Act. This decade, I suspect what you'll see a lot of people doing is like, oh, we're just like packing Black and Latino voters into districts, or because we want to discriminate against Democrats. Lo and behold, they just happen to be Black and brown. So.
That's all the questions we have for now. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm trying to think if I can think of anything else to add. I know you went into great detail about the census. I know I've seen you in several places over the past few weeks. I'm trying to think of some other topics for you to touch on really quick before you have to jump off. What about, could you go over quickly not quickly because I know it's a long winding path, but the outcome of the Perez trial and what that meant for the Voting Rights Act in general? Would you be
Yeah, I mean, like Texas, all Texas and North Carolina are like the stars of redistricting litigation, right? Every decade, they end up being the stars, in part because they're fast-growing states, right? And unfortunately, like the Texas litigation did result in the maps being partially redrawn. Mark Vesey's a member of Congress in North Texas because the maps were redrawn in North Texas. But so there were positive things, but there also were negative things, right? The Supreme Court, allowed a lot of the Texas legislature. So a bit of background. The maps were drawn in 2011. Courts made some changes to those on a temporary basis because it found like they were too discriminatory. Texas then in the next legislative session adopts those temporary maps. There's more challenges to the maps based on some stuff that remained the same. The court, the district court struck those down, and the Supreme Court said no, that was inappropriate because the maps were passed by the 2013 legislature, not the 2011 legislature. And the 2011 legislature may have been really discriminatory when it drew these things. There's no evidence that the 2013 legislature was really discriminatory. They just adopted what the 2011 legislature had done in these particular parts of the state. But they weren't acting discriminatorily, right? Which is like a bunch of, malarkey, as Joe Biden might say. And but that's the way it is. Like, Texas basically got to wash its hands of the discriminatory intent of in 2011 by readopting the maps in 2013. Um, you know, so you know, so
We did have a few more questions if we have some time.
sure, I do.
That came up. Yes. This is someone who says, Jeff Shy, I just started reading Daley's book on redistricting. What are the different lines of thought behind concentration of types of voters in certain districts due to the nature of urbanization versus rural areas? So many Democratic leaning voters may be more concentrated in dense urban areas versus conservative voters being majorities in rural areas. Does this mean that drawing the lines and the potential nuance is largely at the exurb suburbs?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, like, particularly with the suburban switch, right? The suburbs have become really competitive, and Texas has a number of districts that are anchored in the suburbs. And I think that what you might see in Texas, what happened in North Carolina, where you have these districts that are part urban, part suburban, exurban, and then part rural, right? Because you're bringing in the more reliably Republican rural voters to offset the uncertainty in the suburbs, right? And that's, I think, a tool that I think that you're going to see in Texas. If the goal is to maximize the number of Republican seats in Congress, and bear in mind, like, the battle in the next year will be over control of Congress, right? A lot of people say Republicans will try to pick up the majority in Congress in 4 states, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, where they control the redistricting. And that's all they need. I mean, they could also do some gerrymandering elsewhere in the country, pick up a seat here or there, but really, like, the seat, they'll get enough to potentially retake the House, and just from those 4 states, and especially Texas.
So I wanted to jump in with one more very important question that our league members are going to need to have on hand when they go and meet with offices. It was one of the main questions that always came up in the last session when we met with offices. I wanted to give you a minute to tell everyone about the benefits of independent redistricting commissions. I know that we are not going to get one anytime soon, but it's important as we get ready, most likely for the next round of litigation, that we still be very vocal and our support for what we can do to fix the current problems that we're seeing. As the legislator starts drawing these maps and as we see all of these problems unfold, we need to be very vocal and telling them, hey, you guys are doing a bad job, sorry, but that's going to be the truth. And this is what you could do to fix the process. So I wanted you, if you could just really quickly, because I know you have a little bit of research showing the benefits of reform.
Yeah, I mean, independent commissions are, 4 states will use independent commissions this decade, California, Arizona, and then new commissions in Colorado and Michigan. And the experience of California, Arizona over the last couple of decades has been really good. The California maps, California, before it adopted its commission, they had done a bipartisan gerrymander where Democrats and Republicans got together and they agreed everybody's seat would be safe. As a result, only one incumbent in either the state House, state Senate, or Congress lost all decade between 2001 and 2010. And that's really remarkable. There were 400 something races and one incumbent lost. The new maps that the commission drew were much more responsive, right? And a bunch of the seats that Democrats picked up were in Orange County in 2018. Because the benefit is if you keep communities together, it tends to be like community mood shift in tandem. Like, if you're getting mad at your one party or the other, it's likely that your neighbors are, and like that could influence who wins an election. Before people say like, well, that's just benefiting Democrats, Republicans won a bunch of those seats back this year or last year, which was a more pro-Republican year, right? Which is exactly what you want. As the mood of the people kind of shifts, control should shift. And that's what happens in California. It's not what largely happens in a state like Texas or North Carolina, where the maps are sort of like drawn to lock in people. Commissions are also great because they include in the best design, like independence in the process, right? And there's the way that they work, there's independent screening by an independent agency. People are interviewed to make sure that they're qualified, to make sure that they're really Democrats or Republicans as they say they are. but they also did exclude people who have too much connection to the political process, like lobbyists and things like that. There's usually a mix of like random process and deliberate process. So the first 6 commissioners or the first 9 commissioners in California are picked randomly. And then the next, next evenly divided between Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, and then the remaining 6 are picked to balance by the 9 to balance it out. And so for any they are supposed to make sure the commission's diverse and geographically reflective. And then they have strong rules, and they go out and they hear testimony. And the wildfire district that I talked about is a great example. Nobody, when California said let's keep communities together, thought about a wildfire district, but the commission heard lots of testimony about how they were divided among 5 different districts. Nobody paid attention to wildfires. Because they were such a small part of each district, and they really wanted to be in the same district. And this was testimony from Democrats, testimony from Republicans, and the commission found it really compelling. They would have been reasonable not doing that because there are other kinds of communities that they could have drawn districts around, but they said like, this seems like a really compelling thing. And the good news is that they took the job really seriously, and they came up with really good maps. And so commissions can do better, than because the reality is that partisans start out with one thing in mind, and that they back their way into this, right? And so, you're absolutely right. It's not likely that Texas will have an independent commission. It used to be that Republicans in the Texas legislature wanted an independent commission, and then Democrats opposed, and now it's flipped as the control of the legislature has flipped. But there is a possibility of getting commissions through, at least for congressional districts, through legislation like HR 1. So you should certainly also contact your member of Congress and say, please vote for HR 1, which also would do things like automatic voter registration and things like that. Lots of small dollar public financing, lots of really good things that would help protect our democracy, but it also would mandate independent commissions for redistricting. And so, there are surprisingly a number of Democrats in Congress who are a little bit uncertain about commissions. So it wouldn't hurt to call your member of Congress and say, we need this.
Muted. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We greatly appreciate you being able to be here with us. So thank you for your time.
Glad to do it. And if there's anything we can do for you guys, just feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yep. Bye.
All right. I think now we're going to be welcoming Cinde Weatherby. Cinde, are you here? Oh, Cinde, you're muted. There we go.
Well, thank you very much for that great explanation about redistricting. It's something that really means a great deal to our state, as you can tell. We are so pleased today to have 2 extremely accomplished and engaging women offer their time to us this morning. And want to thank you both very much for spending your time with us today. Dr. Victoria Defrancesco-Soto is a nationally renowned individual for her expertise about immigration, women in politics, political psychology and campaigns, and elections. She's a University of Texas LBJ School administrator, researcher, and an active professor, and appears frequently on many national television, radio programs, and most recently was a featured expert in the PBS documentary on Willie Velasquez. Willie Velasquez, Your Vote is Your Voice, about that civil rights trailblazer. But whether it's on PBS or Real Time with Bill Maher, a little bit of a different audience, she easily translates her considerable social science research into relatable information for a wide variety of audiences. Similarly, we are also very grateful to have Dr. Melanie Price, an endowed professor of political science at Prairie View A&M University, and the principal investigator for its African American Studies Initiative, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. She was recently named the inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Race and Justice. She too is equally well sought after for national news outlets in print, television, and radio. And Dr. Price is also the author of 2 books, The Race Whisperer, Barack Obama and the Political Uses of Race, and Dreaming Blackness, Black Nationalism and African American Public Opinion, both published by the NYU Press. We seem to have a lot of NYU being mentioned here this morning. Given our tight schedule, we're going to dive right in to hear their perspectives and opinions about Texas voting and elections, and what we've seen and can expect as it relates to our Mexican American, Latino, and African American voters and non-voters. We've asked them to address 3 questions and asked them to keep their responses to 5 minutes each to allow us a little bit of audience participation at the end. So I'm going to start first. I'll ask, doing it the old-fashioned League of Women Voters way. We're going to alternate, each of you being first for the question. And I'll ask Dr. Defrancesco-Soto to begin, and I'll put my 5-minute timer on, and then we'll switch off to Dr. Price. The question is, what is your respective observations on the November 2020 election, both the results and the resulting current state of voting rights for Latino and African American Texans? Dr. Defrancesco-Soto.
Thanks, Cindy. And please call me Vicki. It's a lot easier. And I want to thank you, Cindy and Grace, and all of you joining us today. I am such a fan, so respectful of the work that the League of Women Voters does. So that's a really big question, Cindy. I'm going to give some very top level points here and try to cede my time to the Q&A. But first things first, good news. We saw a jump in voter turnout across the country. I mean, what was it? It was record breaking in terms of we hadn't seen such a high percentage of voter turnout since 120 years, like 1908. I think that was the last election. 2/3 of the American eligible population turned out to vote. Here in Texas, we had record breaking turnout. It didn't quite surpassed the 1992 high watermark when George H.W. Bush and Ross Perot were on the ballot. But still, I mean, we just saw this massive wave of voters saying, I want my voice to be heard. I'm coming out and I'm doing it, even if there's a pandemic, even if my state has put voting restrictions in front of me over the past couple of months, I am coming out and I am exercising my right to vote. So that, I think, is one of the biggest take homes of this election. And I pray to God that it will set precedent that we continue to grow, right? So that it becomes a positive habit in doing that. When we look at Texas and the turnout specifically in Texas, again, overall turnout was up everywhere. Turnout, I think, in every county except maybe 1 or 2 was also up. Another big piece here is early voting turnout was up. And this is so remarkable because we know that we had the dubious honor of being one of the states. Well, we've always been very restrictive in our voting, but especially in the midst of the pandemic, there were additional restrictions, yet we saw early voting turnout. If we weren't the highest, we were probably tied. You know, everything is all fuzzy now as I'm thinking back to the election, but we were up there. So that's the big take home, right? Turnout was up across the board. Latino turnout was up a little bit, but it was more or less flat. Youth turnout was up, African American turnout was up. But one thing I do want to highlight here, and I know we're going to touch on it in one of the following questions, and we can go into it further, but demography is not destiny. So I think a lot of folks, as we saw the early vote totals rolling in and everybody's eyes were popping and they're going like, oh my God, look at Texas. There's going to be a blue tsunami because there's so many folks turning out. You know, what's the popular saying? Texas is not, you know, a red state, it's a non-voting state. You know, I think this election proved that that's not the case. And I've always told folks, demography is not destiny. You know, there are Black folks and brown folks who, you know, see things in the Republican Party they like, see things in Trump that they like. Also, Trump did a very good job of courting, especially Latino voters, not so much Black voters. So we need to understand that it's not that easy, that we need to understand what's going on in rural versus urban, what's going on in terms of outreach, what's going on at kind of the micro level. So I think, Cinde, I'm going to leave us with that. Those are the two big take homes for me in terms of turnout. Wow, awesome. And in terms of voter preference, we got to be a little bit more careful in our generalizations.
Thank you very much. Dr. Price.
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate with Vicki that Melanie is fine.
All right.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's really interesting because Vicki and I know a million people in common, but we've never been on a panel before. So finally, it's our Texas connection that sort of gets us together. So that's really nice as well. One of the things that I tell people often, when they're looking for political information, my first answer is always the League of Women Voters. They have all the answers. And so if my students are like, do you need a ballot? League of Women Voters. You need to know anything about the candidates? League of Women Voters. So I think all American government professors say that. So it's very cool to actually be a part of this process. And so I'll say a couple of things about the election and just some reflections. I think Vicki is right where, you've said so much about this now that it's actually starting to become like so many things have happened in the interim. This is the moment where we were supposed to be processing the 2020 election, thinking about what happened, writing about what happened, and every day there's something new to write about. So it'll be good to talk about that as well, I think. I always want to start with the Prairie View example and talk about the ways in which it sort of, I think, is symbolic of a lot of questions and challenges in the state of Texas, right? Michael Lee mentioned the idea that Texas legislators might try to focus on white rural voters as a way of shoring up their support. But when I heard him say that, the first thing I thought is that's bad news for Prairie View, right? So because we are in a white rural county. And so whatever they do to help to augment those counties means that they also are going to be helping to disenfranchise nearly 10,000 African-American students. And so always I think about those things in tandem. As we were preparing, thinking about, talking about the 2020 election, our students were in federal court testifying about the 2018 election, right? And so they haven't even resolved, those kids, some of them have graduated, they have gone on to do other things, and they are still in court talking about not the coming election. So in September, they were in court trying to say my rights were violated 2 years ago, right? And we haven't fixed what happened 2 years ago as we stand on the doorstep of a new election. And so I should also say that Prairie View is my alma mater. And so when I was there in the 1990s, 19 students were indicted falsely for voter fraud. And so there was a whole protest movement around that. And so there is a long history connected to this. And as we think about sort of those kinds of places you can look to learn really a lot about the insidious nature of local politics, I think it is a place you should probably look. I'm going to put a plug in here. I usually don't do that, but one of the things that we're announcing this week with the launch of the Ruth J. Simmons Center is an HBCU voting rights project where we're going to it's a digital humanities lab where we'll start to collect, disseminate this kind of information, do more oral histories, more community testimony, like that sort of thing. So look out for that. I also think it's important to talk about the fact that the 2020 success that Vicki talked about will also mean the 2021 revenge, right? We already see that in Georgia. Let's talk about the success though. So we know about the jump in voter turnout. There's a greater number of women running for office, period. There was a record number of Republican women running. And so we also, when we think about not generalizing around people of color and who they were going to support, we also need to talk about the ways in which these women were, and on the Republican side, were mostly challengers from the right, So they were not moderators. They were not consensus builders. They were people who were in fact challenging people from the right, like the person who is in the news right now, who is Marjorie Taylor Greene. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a gender component to what is happening with her, right? And so I am no fan, as you can imagine, of this woman, but I will say that we have spent the last 2 weeks talking about her and not about Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, right? Because she is an easy target. She can be taken down. It's a much more complicated process to do that for these two men. Anyway, and I'm not a fan of hers, but I'm saying there's always gender in the works. We always need to be thinking about it. For me, the story of hope always comes with grassroots politics. When people ask me, what's the thing that makes you hopeful? I'm often saying what happens in the streets. And we saw the power of grassroots mobilization, particularly in Georgia and Arizona. I think that there will be a push in Texas to build on some of the existing grassroots mobilization, but to really key in on trying to amplify. Keep in mind, it's easier to do that in Georgia. It's easier because it's a smaller state, fewer people. It's a different process. Doing that in Texas, which is it's humongous. Doing it across all that time will require more money, will require more people, will require more strategy. And so I think that's a place where Texas will be looking. People like Fair Fight are already looking for Southern states to try to expand. And so I think that's something we should be looking out for. But the thing that I think is also interesting is most of these grassroots organizations came in to help the Democratic Party, but they are not controlled by the Democratic Party. And so what that means is when Joe Biden and the Biden administration disappoints them, and they all do, it's not personal, all of them will eventually disappoint, they can also use that same mobilization to challenge those people. And so I think that'll be very interesting. And when I say less protection, Michael Lee basically covered all of that, right? About the ways in which, all the things that used to be in play that made this more difficult, didn't stop it, just made it more difficult. Many of them have been taken out. I also have been really excited about the ways in which in 2020 and the global pandemic forced us to think about more small d democratic ways of participating. And so I live in Harris County, and in Harris County, we have drive-through voting. We had all different ways to think about voting that I think once all citizens, regardless of party, have been given access to, it's very difficult to take it back, right? And so the number of people voting in drive-through, drive-up voting, 24-hour voting, all of these kinds of things, they were across racial groups, they were across income groups, and they were across party lines. And so I use my nephew as an example. He's 30 and he's like, I will never step into a voting place again. I expect to drive through for the rest of my life. And I was like, first of all, that's dramatic. Second of all, I think that kind of thing will be challenged, but I think it's the kind of thing that could have legs. And I think it means that it has certainly shored up Lena Hidalgo's position in the county, but what it also does is sort of become a model for understanding, and people are watching. And so I think I will stop there and then let us sort of move on with the conversation.
Great. Well, I hope you can stick around for some of our later conversations, because we're going to touch on that very topic. Yeah. And look forward to working with you to getting those messages out to the people you're going to be communicating with.
Yeah.
So we'll start next with you, Dr. Price, Melanie. We'd like to know your views on, you evidently were there listening to Michael Lee, your views on Texas redistricting process and its impact. You started a little bit about Prairie View, but across the state, the impact on African Americans and Latinos.
Oh, Vicki and I both, I think, are native Texans, right? Who have lived in other places. And so it's interesting to have watched Texas politics on the outside. And actually, I came back to Texas in in 2019. So from afar, I saw what happened when the Democrats fled the state and all this other stuff. And I was like, this is nuts. Like, this cannot happen again. But I also saw Shelby v. Holder, and I was like, well, all bets are off. And I think until we have the passage again of some kind of Voting Rights Act, then the way in which this is going to be fought out is people of color in communities will be suing for rights, and they will end up like my students. That is, claiming that elections 2 years ago, their rights were violated. And so I am very concerned about what this means going forward and what it actually means for me, I think, and this is a place where I'm less optimistic, is that we are going to continue to have a majority white leadership because not because they have persuaded the voters, but because they have juked the stats, right? And that means that it only makes it harder to convince people of color, if they know that the system is rigged, to convince them to participate, to convince them that there's value in their voice, and to convince them that they should run for office themselves. And so I am very concerned about the ways in which this moment where my students are keenly focused on politics, they are super interested in what is happening in politics now, and very, very, very cautious about participating. Right? And any story that suggests that the game is rigged, they latch on to it. And so we have seen increased voter turnout among young people across several cycles. But if we are able to create the kinds of maps that I suspect they want to create in the state of Texas, then my students will then be back to saying, why should I participate? What does it matter? That's the thing that concerns me about redistricting. All people of color, they're going to participate. It is their civic duty. You know, the civil rights generation, they see this as a cause to live. My mom and her sister in their 70s, they were trying to figure out how they were going to vote. And when they were concerned that their absentee ballots might not work, they put those masks on and they walked into voting booths, both of whom have had health challenges during this pandemic. That's how serious they take it. That's right. Not how serious people under 30 take it. And so we really need, if we are going to be a place, if we are going to be the state that we like to brag about, because, you know, outside of Texas, any Texan, they always brag about Tex-Mex. They brag about Buffalo Soldiers. They brag about all the things they brag about, you know, football, which is mostly a Black, you know, played sport. They brag about those things. If we are going to be the things we brag about, then we should give those people a voice. We should deal with them fairly. And I think I'll stop there because I feel like I'm rambling anyway.
Vicki, would you chime in?
There is a lot to chime in here. So first, I'm Texan by marriage.
Oh, I thought you were from here. Yeah.
But I mean, I got the crash course. I have the certificate, right? I'm legit. But my other loyalty goes to Arizona. So I'm originally from Southeast Arizona. So it's been really interesting, you know, looking at Arizona and Texas together, you know, because of my political science hat, but also my personal interest in it and seeing them. And, you know, I wrote down a couple of things here that I want to get to. And the first is, you know, for Democrats, the story beyond the win, but digging beyond, was Georgia and Arizona. And Arizona, and looking at the Latino electorate, that was, as Melanie pointed out, about an investment over the last decade in grassroots and harnessing the anger of folks toward SB 1070 and Sheriff Joe Arpaio and a lot of young folks. I do think that the Democratic establishment is looking to put more money, especially the more progressive end, in Texas. So we'll see that growth. But, you know, as an Arizona native and understanding kind of the cultural nuance, it's different. So it's not California, it's not Texas. but Arizona is somewhere in the middle. And Texas, as I've learned over the last decade or so, and now being a Texan by marriage, there's a different cultural component. So while I think it can help the Latino vote go in a more progressive direction, I think that there are some elements to just the state of Texas that are going to put a little bit of a stop on that. Not completely, but I just think we always need to have that Texas v. California v. Arizona perspective. So, okay, so the kind of cultural regional piece, amen to the revenge part that Melanie was talking about. So, you know, we saw that in 2020, I would argue here in Texas. Remember, there was a lot of talk about, you know, the blue wave, that look at all of the advances that Democrats made in 2018, look at Peto, look at all the House pickups. And you know what Republicans did? They went, oh crap, let's get our butt in gear. And so for every action, there is a reaction. And in 2022 and 2024, there is going to be that. And circling back to the point about when the game is rigged, you lose people. Yeah, you lose young folks. You especially lose young folks of color. And then let me layer on top of that the fact that we're not pants on fire. So during the Trump administration, we were pants on fire for pretty much the whole 4 years. We started off with the Muslim ban, and then we had child separation, and then the violations toward Black folks and Black Lives Matter and the pandemic. So you had this mega mobilizing force of fear, anger, pants on fire. You're not going to have that, I hope, in the next 2 to 4 years under Joe Biden. So that is going to be another potentially demobilizing force, in addition to the fact that there's already those built-in institutional barriers. Revenge, why participate, Arizona model. Cinde, going back to your original question about redistricting, it's not going to be pretty, but I'm not telling you anything new. You know, you had Michael, one of the foremost experts, talking through this. And I will put one spin on this, which is not only are we going to see a kind of depression of minority of color voting, I've always been of the belief that this system of packing folks into these districts, so packing all the Black and brown folks, i.e. Dems, into one district, and packing all those rural Republicans into another, that has a trickle up divisive effect on our politics. So if you are an elected official and you're beholden to Republicans and Democrats, you know, say you're a 40-60 district, you're not going to be as extreme and divisive. But if you answer to pretty much only 80% Ds or 80% Rs, what is the incentive for you to cooperate? Not much, because remember, your bosses are, you know, a super majority of Ds or a super majority of Rs, so that when you get to the Hill, why am I going to talk to the other side? So I know I'm being, you know, I'm exaggerating a bit here, but I do think that on the ground redistricting that packs and cracks and does all of that is just hurtful to us in many, many ways. You know, as an Arizona native, we've done a lot of crazy things, but I am very proud of the state's, you know, non-political, nonpartisan redistricting commission. You know, it is a fantasy of mine to get Texas to that point. My hope is that maybe once the Ds start making a little bit more inroads, the Rs will be willing to talk about having that. So, you know, I think that the packing of folks together is just hurtful to us on so many levels. I'll end with this. I'll end with the fact that, you know, Texas is an example, though, even though institutionally we're rigged, even though we're so divided as a country, I do think that Texas is primed for continuing to vote, that we can use the examples of past successes, because I mean, remember the Voter ID Act, the Photo Voter ID Act, it had a slight depressive effect, and it was obviously targeted toward Black and brown and poor white folk. But we have overcome that because we have been able to really harness the power of folks to say, we can do this. And it's through organizations such as the League of Women Voters. Melanie knows this, one of the truisms in political science is the mobilization theory by Rosenstone and Hansen. When you get a bunch of lower SES folks, we're less likely to turn out and vote because we have less time, less money, less education. But the one counteracting factor to that is mobilization. So even though we've got institutions up against us and we've got, you know, the fact that we're poor and less educated, if we have a really coordinated and strong effort by organizations such as the League, such as the Brennan Center, all of these organizations that come to mobilize us, that is the most powerful tool that we have. And now more than ever, we need to push stronger because of, you know, the shenanigans of redistricting that's going to happen and the lack of drama that we're going to see, at least from the federal level.
Can I just add that I think one of the things that will help in efforts of people like, I'm sorry, there's a ambulance or something, but can't control outside.
We don't hear it.
One of the things that will help, I think, in this moment, the League, the other kinds of advocacy groups that will help people who are trying to fight for a fairer redistricting plan is how interested people are in politics in this moment because of the economy, because of the global pandemic. And so people are paying attention to politics as a way to fix certain things that are happening that are key in our society. And so while you have their attention about anything related to politics, now is the time, I think, to throw in the things that are also important to you, right? And so people are paying attention and you want to take advantage of that. And I think until this pandemic has subsided, they will be paying attention to politics. You know, I found myself watching Governor Cuomo's daily address from It made no sense. I'm not in New York. It doesn't affect me in any way, but people are watching. And so I think that's sort of one of the weapons against some of the shenanigans in the state of Texas is the fact that normally no one is watching. And so I only remember when the last redistricting effort because they fled the state. Like that's the only thing I remember about it. But now people are watching because they want to know what the state is doing. They want to know how they can get their vaccines, and they know that's coming from the state. And so while they're watching, throw it at them.
Well, both of you ladies have given us a preview of what we're going to be talking about the rest of this meeting. And I hate to give you the bad news, but there are moves afoot to return to all the bad voter ID.
Of course.
And all those things you can imagine. Or horrors. And personally, I'm very excited about all of our collaborators that we've had that have sprung up, organized, and helped to mobilize all fractions of our society. So finally, let's hit this question and start with you, Vicki. Your observations and predictions for future Texas trends in voting and the legislative process, especially noting that majority Latino Texas population in currently probably in the next census, and what the impacts of that is on Latinos, African Americans, other minorities, and the rest of the population.
Thanks, Cindy. And in fact, I think it's this summer the Latinos in Texas are poised to become the majority population. Is that right? I mean, like 2021, I'm like, oh my God, we're in 2021.
Yep.
And so I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but demography is not destiny. And so that is what we have to keep in mind when we're looking at the change of the state and politics. Now, with regards to what this is going to look like in, kind of our legislative process, what it's going to look like, in terms of issues that come up, I think that is you have a growing Latino population, regardless of, exactly how they cleave R or how they cleave D, the issues that affect Latino populations and Black populations and low-income white populations, I hope, will continue to press up. We continue to lag behind in terms of education. We continue to lag behind in terms of healthcare. Latinos in Texas have the dubious honor of having the lowest rates of insurance. So I hope, I guess I'm being a cautious optimist here, that is, you have more and more Latinos, and more Latinos make up the state, and more Latinos are uninsured, that maybe in the medium term, short to medium, who knows, maybe even long term, we see the reconsideration of the Medicaid expansion. Is this something that's put on the ballot? Is this something that our lawmakers start to consider because of this fact, and harnessing the fact that we're coming out of the pandemic where Latinos and African Americans were the hardest hit? So for me, healthcare is something I'm always thinking about when we're talking about our minority populations. Education as well. Another dubious honor. We're toward the bottom of the barrel of our education system. I don't know, we're ranked always somewhere in the lower high 40s. And here's the deal. The money that we invest in our public schools now, whether they be traditional public schools or charter type public schools, that's an investment on the workforce of Texas. Texas always likes to boast about how, cutting edge it is in business and, and it's a great place to come. Well, yeah, that's great. But if we have a very lowly educated population, places aren't going to want to come here, even if we have cut rate tax bases. So we need to figure out how we educate this population, because in a lot of our major cities, the majority of our first graders, our kindergartners are Latino, and that's going to start generalizing across the board. So the issue, I think, of healthcare and of education, where we've kind of been like, oh, well, that's poor folks, let's not pay attention to that. That is going to have to bubble up. Throw this one in here because it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I did some work on it, was what we're going to do with women and the care industry. So, Texas was not alone in being really hard hit by the pandemic, especially women, who were disproportionately in the service sector, disproportionately Black and brown women. And so what is going to happen about how we think about how we provide childcare, how we provide schooling, right? All of the things that are involved in that. Because I think we, as a nation, and Texas should be part of this, how do we support women? How do we provide them the resources and the tools to then be engaged in the workforce? How do we provide those tools to support women so that they don't have to multitask, or so that they don't have to choose between working or staying at home with their kids because there really aren't any affordable childcare options, and it actually costs more to pay childcare than you're going to be earning going to work. So I think, the biggies, Texas specific, are healthcare and education. Nationally, I want us to think about women. I mean, the League of Women Voters. This is who we are. This is, we got the right to vote 100 years ago. That's great. But you know what? In terms of the support that we have to engage in our workforce, it's embarrassing. And it's embarrassing when we look at our counterparts in the OECD. We're, again, bottom of the barrel. And I'm going to end my comments before seeing over to Melanie with a shameless plug. But in terms of how do we move the needle, we move the needle by getting the voices of the people who are affected into power. And that is women. And so we just opened up our applications for the second cohort of the LBJ Women's Campaign School. I will drop the link in the chat. It is a nonpartisan training. We are fashioning ourselves after the Yale School. Hopefully we won't take overtaking Yale. It's a fantastic program. It's, find out more about it. I won't talk any more about our school, but this is how you make impact, because this really is the ultimate form of civic engagement when you run for office. And God knows we need more women who are thinking the right way to run and represent us.
Thank you. Melanie.
I think, let me just say, lots of women, when we talk to women about why they don't run for office, a lot of them say it's because they don't get asked. So just start asking women who you see doing great stuff, why don't you run for office? I ask my students all the time, like, have you thought about running for office? If I meet somebody in a bureaucratic job and they're doing really good at it, I'm like, why don't you run for office? Anyway, so just start asking, because they say it's because they haven't been asked. I think one of the things we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future is dealing with what we have lost in this pandemic. You know, our students, I keep going back to them, but you know, we are a majority Black college. And then we have a small but growing population of Latino students. And so some of my colleagues were doing a survey, like sort of looking at sort of COVID experiences. And they found that 80% of our students know someone who's either has had COVID or know someone who's had COVID. And 40% of them know someone who has died from COVID. That's a huge amount for a campus to have to deal with when we all come back together. But it's not just that, it's also the children who haven't logged on. It's also the fact that the only way to deal with this crisis is by logging on. And we know there's a great digital divide in terms of demography, in terms of on all kinds of levels. And so for me, also, we haven't grieved any of this stuff. You know, students will come back to class without their teachers. They will come back to class with, we don't know sort of what this is going to mean for us as a society. And the thing that concerns me about that is the lack of generosity of spirit that exists in our politics right now. That is the unwillingness to see people as humans deserving of help, right? To always see offering people help as a way of being scammed, right? We're always focusing on the scammers, never talking about the people who by far are the people who will be helped by things. And so I'm very concerned about that on lots of levels. So for me, that means, if you want policies, universal health care. I mean, if we had universal health care, we wouldn't have to figure out how we're going to dispense these vaccines, because you could just go to your clinic. Where universal health care, you wouldn't have to line up at stadiums to test. You could just go to your clinic. There are all kinds of things about this health crisis that would have been helpful if we weren't hoarding medical services for those people who can't afford it. My iPad just died, so I'm going to try to remember the other things that I had written down here. So the other things that I'm thinking about generational shifts. We are on a precipice of a historic moment in terms of politics, the economy, and the healthcare system. And I'm wondering about sort of what this means. We are seeing in other parts of the country established Black and brown candidates, established women candidates who are being primaried for the first time, many of them. And I'm thinking about when that's going to hit Texas and what it's going to look like. I live in Sheila Jackson Lee's district. She is essentially seen as untouchable, but if you talk to people on the ground, there are people who are talking about, why isn't she being challenged? Why do people never run against her? And that's happening across Black and Latino districts across the country. These younger activists are aging into running for office, right? They're about at the point where they start seeing electoral office as the next step in their politics, right? And so I'm interested in thinking about what that's going to look like in this state and who are the emerging leaders. That's why the campaign school and things like that are super important, because we want to nurture the people who are going to lead us next, right? We want to make sure that we mentor them, that they have access to information, that they have access to campaign funds. And there was something else, but I don't know because my iPad died, so I don't remember what it is. But those are the things that I'm sort of, I'm interested in Black-Brown solidarity. I'm interested in looking at if Georgia can figure out how they're going to have lots of cross-racial solidarity among people of color, I feel like we could figure it out too. And so I am interested in looking at the efforts across the state of people who are trying to figure out ways that we can use this majority of color population in powerful ways. And so those are the things that I'm sort of focused on. I'll stop there.
Well, we'll really look forward to hearing what your ideas are about that.
I mean, I don't have a lot. I just.
But it's a subject we care a lot about.
Right. It's something I'm very, oh, that's the other thing. I'm sorry. The last thing is I am also interested in the ways that we are finally going to have to come to grips in both parties about the relationships between women, but in different ways. Right. And that is the Republican Party is going to have to think about how some of the things that they promote in terms of family values jives with these Republican women who are being elected, who are for the most part very savvy, politically engaged, professional women, right? This is not sort of the Phyllis Schlafly example. And so you have, I think for the last time, the leader of the Republican National Committee standing up there explaining how she has all these kids and how she's a homemaker and all this other stuff. They're going to have to come to grips with that. I think on the Democratic side, white women and women of color are going to have to figure out how they are going to decide which kinds of candidates can represent them both, which kinds of ways and the ways that they can work together. It's a conversation, I think, that looms large on the internet. So if you look at social media, you look at those kinds of places, this is a conversation that people are talking about. And I think, you know, we have to figure those kinds of things out as well.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Well, it looks like we may have a few minutes at least for some audience questions. So I'm going to ask my fellow league member, Sophie Levin-Kuhn, to let us know if you have any questions to offer us.
Thank you, Cinde. We do have some questions.
Wonderful.
From Erin Leonard, she says, one thing that concerns me is that the fraud claims were based on that many of the fraud claims were based on the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. Erin thinks the mail-in ballots leveled the playing field and made voting so much more accessible and fair. Is there any way to strengthen the mail-in ballot and make it available to all?
One of the things I think about that is like when people mention those mail-in ballots, on April 15th every year, you see people lined up at the mail to pay their taxes. They're sending checks into the federal government. They're sending all kinds of stuff. We mail all kinds of things. People mail wheels. People mail things because they believe that it's a patent. It's like a poor man's patent. But yet voting somehow is the one thing we cannot do in the mail. It is the one thing that somehow the mail makes it illegitimate. And it didn't happen when when businessmen voted by mail because they were traveling. When wealthy people voted by mail because they were too busy to stand in line at a poll, none of that mattered. Mail-in ballots, absentee ballots were fine. People never questioned them. They never asked you why. You could just say you were out of the county, you were out of your jurisdiction place. But now that it has become more populous, then the question becomes, and until you start complaining about mailing in your taxes and other things, as a matter of fact, people who submit their taxes on the internet should be open to voting on the internet because that's much more of your private information than what's on a ballot.
So essentially, I think there's a larger problem. I mean, the problem about the fraud claims are important, but there's a larger concept of just fake news that people can say things that are false and they start to be taken as truth. So I think we need to nestle in the mail-in ballot controversy within this larger fact that folks are claiming things that aren't so as being so.
Right.
So that is the bigger issue. I'm going back to my Arizona example. So as Melanie highlighted, you had folks who would do absentee voting because they were traveling or whatnot. Arizona has been voting by mail, like really open vote by mail laws for like 20 years. And so suddenly, something's wrong with it. And I think luckily Arizona, the fact that they were so strong in mail-in voting helped give Doug Ducey the political leverage to certify the vote, because it had a legacy of mail-in voting and it wasn't some fluke. So, I mean, I think it is a much bigger issue that we need to confront as a society in terms of swatting down these falsehoods. And I think within that, I'm coming back to the need to have organizations such as this dispel these myths. Because it's like gossip. It's like the game telephone, right? You hear one person from the other person, and there was a lot of disinformation. I know within the Latino community, where WhatsApp is very popular because you have a lot of transnational and immigrant community folks, there were these rampant, lies being spread on WhatsApp. And the most effective way to combat that isn't telling people to watch the nightly news.
Right.
It's engaging one-on-one with folks. It's each one of you members of the league that your cousin or your aunt is saying this type of stuff, like, is not being angry and being like, you ignorant person, you don't understand. It's saying, no, here, let's walk through this. Let me tell you why. Because if there's one thing the D's get terribly wrong, is we are arrogant, because we're arrogant, and I'm just going to leave it there. So we need to be humble and engage with folks who have regrettably been engaged in these falsehoods, and walk them through what the data is and help them understand.
You have anything to add, Melanie?
Oh, I liked it all.
Are there other questions?
Oh, actually, let me just say this. I think kitchen table politics are the politics that are going to make this country better. I think what we talk about now, all of the people, like I grew up, in a very sort of Texas Southern context where you don't talk about politics or pastors. You don't have those kinds of conversations, over the dinner table. I think we need to do more talking over the dinner table. I think there are lots of relationships that have to be mended. I think that there's a way in which the last 4 years has sort of isolated a lot of people who are not extremists, but also went underground because of their support in Trump, and they saw how unpopular it was. And isolation is the key, I think, to sort of leading people towards extremism and away from the Democratic community. I think we have to do lots of those kinds of conversations. And look, nobody probably more than me and Vicki have had more conversations with people in classes who have said things that we thought were like completely inane. We don't stand there and say, do you know that is the nuttiest question? I mean, we might go home and think it, but we don't say it there. And I think if people sort of came at, I have a policy in my classroom, and I think everybody should adopt it. I deal with people, I give people the benefit of the doubt first. That is, I feel like you're asking this question because you really need to know the answer, or you really think you really believe that, but you don't have enough facts. I deal with you in a very different way. But at the point that I start to come to know you as a person who is just trying to stir the pot, then I deal with you in a different way. I think we deal with everybody as if they're trying to stir the pot, right? We don't begin with, are you actually asking me a question that you don't know the answer to? Are you saying this from an experience that you're coming from, and I have more information than you, and so maybe I can help you with that? Like why and how are you asking me this question is as important as the question they're asking, even if it's something that you find offensive. And I've been asked a lot of offensive questions in my time. But I don't always assume that the person who's asking me knows it's offensive. That's one. Mm-hmm. And I don't assume that I can't help them overcome the offensiveness.
Great policy. Sophie, are there more questions?
Yes, this is.
Take one more.
Okay, this is actually going off of what Dr. Price was just speaking about. This question is from Ruth Rubio. She says, what are the effects of increased white supremacy and recent violence on voter participation?
Look, I think for African Americans, it increases voter participation. It increases participation, period. I mean, I have often said, even before the moment that we're in, that a way for Black candidates to mobilize Black voters is if there is perceived racism against that candidate. When Barack Obama was running for office, my mom would donate money every time she felt like somebody did something racist to him. Every time. Oh, that is offensive. Let me give him $25 more. Even though in the beginning I was like, you're not going to get this money back. This is not the church. It's not tax deductible. Like, I'm telling her this, but it is a way, I think, especially for the Black community. I can't say for sure for the Latino community, but I think it's true for the Latino community too. It is a way to sort of get the guard up. We know how to get behind challenging white supremacy. I think what is harder is maintaining that for a long fight, right? And white supremacy is a very long fight. There is no rest. It mutates. It's like whack-a-mole. You knock it down, it pops back up again. It is among the young. It is among the old. It is everywhere. And so I think we know how to fight it, but I think we're always having to adjust to those mutations. But if you make it clear, even the white people, I think, the ways in which this is tied to a white supremacist notion, often, if they know it and believe you, because believing is part of that too. That's where the fake news part comes in, right? Because you're not always believed. And it turns out expertise, there is even a backlash between, like, you have all these Yale lawmakers who graduated from Yale and Harvard talking about the educated elite. And I'm like, everything you've ever done is Ivy League. Like, I don't understand. But anyway, there's a backlash against sort of the educated elite as well. So if they believe you, I think there's a way of overcoming this. I tell people all the time, like, I'm thinking about January 6th. I was watching it with my mom. I live with my mom, so we were watching it together. And, we're watching it. We're astounded by what is happening. But the whole time we're like, they're going to get away with this. We know it. We're Americans. We know that these people, most of them are going to get away with it. We know they're going to be apologetic. We know it, and we know that we could never do it. Mm. And that's the sting of race in America. Not that we want to take over the Capitol, not that me and my mother ever want to be out there doing that, but we know that if we ever even tried, we wouldn't get away with it. And it's lots of things like that I think people are grappling with right now. People are feeling very emotional around this. People are feeling like, racism. Look, racism explains the disparity in the outcomes in COVID. Racism explains why 1.5 million people in Florida have been vaccinated and less than 80,000 of them are Black. And so right now, African Americans as a community are heavily focused on white supremacy, but they are as focused on what whites who claim they are not white supremacists are going to do in this moment. And the fear, because history tells us this is probably going to happen, is that whites will consolidate themselves at the expense of people of color. And so we are hoping and waiting in this moment that Joe Biden, in an effort to claim unity, will not throw people of color under the bus, will not ignore the people who got him there, will not accept policies that are detrimental to the people who are crucial to his success. And there is no guarantee that that will happen, and we know it, but it is the hope of people of color. It is their commitment and their critical patriotism that forces them to keep participating in the process.
Vicki, do you have anything to add?
Just quickly, I'll add on a couple of points, reinforcing what Melanie said. I think the first is the constant, right? So I look at white supremacy also with the Latino lens and immigration. And, I'm teaching my immigration grad seminar this semester. And on Tuesday, we're going to be talking about the know-nothings, right? So really, when you look at the rhetoric, there's not much difference between this movement prior to the Civil War and what we're seeing right now and what we've seen at different points in history. So regrettably, there is that xenophobic in-group, out-group, in different countries, it's along tribal lines, but here our fault line is a racial fault line. So it comes and goes, it'll go from dog whistle to bullhorn. It is a constant. And so we can't just hope that it will one day go away. We need to figure out how we're going to manage it. Digging down into the effect of white supremacy on the Latino electorate, it's a bit more mixed. I think because remember, Latinos are white, Black, Asian, they can be of any racial group. And so the effect of, the insurrection or the effect of white nationalism is going to fall differently on how different Latinos identify themselves. So that, I think, is the nuance and understanding, kind of the minority coalition, but that the impacts of them are differential. I do think that among your younger, more progressive Latinos, it's having the same impact as it does among the Black community. Among older folks, maybe even more conservative folks, I think that's where you start to see some differences, hence why some of these folks did end up voting for Donald Trump. So I think I'll end there in terms of reminding everyone to look at the nuance of the racial differences, the generational differences among the Latino community, and the vigilance to the constancy of this.
When we think about white supremacy, one of the things that I am constantly encouraging people to think about is to think about voter suppression, the attacks on immigration, and these new calls to end birthright citizenship as all a white supremacist project. They're all in the same family. It's not about, immigration is about who's coming and how that changes the whiteness of this country. Voter suppression is about who's voting and how it changes the whiteness of this country. Birthright citizenship is about who's having kids and how it changes the whiteness of this country. And so I take all of those three things together. I take I take these immigration stances where you're attacking, oh, look at this caravan of people, fear the caravans, right? I take all of those things under the same white supremacist lens as the voter suppression and these calls to end birthright citizenship. It is all a way of saying this country is becoming too of color, too non-white, and we must stop it.
Well, I hate to end our session with that note, but it's certainly an important one to make.
Yes.
We've got to close up here and take a short break. And thank you very much for participating with us this morning. We're going to take a break and come back at 11:45, maybe 11:46, but make it quick. Thank you so much. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, I'll see you guys later.
Thanks. While we're getting ready to go, wasn't that a great morning that we've had so far? And I was really happy to see the emphasis from each of our speakers on mobilizing, that's how we make things happen, and going on the record. I'm Cinde Weatherby. You've already seen me this morning. I serve as the Voting Rights and Election Law Issue Chair for the League of Women Voters. And Lobby Day is all about talking about presenting our points of view in the legislative session. This is a special COVID photo that I found that happened to have colors of our league celebration of voting after 100 years, gold and purple. There's no argument that can be made that we have never been in a situation like this session before in our lifetimes. And I certainly don't want to see that going forward to 2023 or any of our special sessions, but it's affecting everything we do during the session. Our participation will be done in different ways. It'll be more limited than ever before, but we are league members and and our affiliated collaborators who are committed to being diligent in representing our points of view and providing voting for the public. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly go over a few things in this presentation and talk about how the League of Women Voters does its advocacy. Every group has its style, and this is the kind of style that we have and are committed to. And you can go to the next slide. The League knows, and many of our collaborators know, that election integrity has nothing to do with jailing people or putting forth any kind of rationale to keep people from voting. What true election integrity means is offering voting to every eligible citizen of the state of Texas who wants to vote. And we have to be counted speaking those truths. We have to tell our personal stories. Many of us, like me, don't have a problem voting typically, though I've heard stories of white middle class voters also being affected. I was easily able to vote, but we need to highlight those who consistently have roadblocks put in front of them, and we need to have their stories told. Those stories need to be addressed to their own state representatives and state senators. Like every session is done, a lot of the action takes place outside of public view. This session is going to be no different, other than we'll have less public view than normal. But we know that some of the more hurtful bills to election integrity will happen behind closed doors at the last minute, just like last session, Senate Bill 9 did. It was passed by one of the houses without a lot of public input. But we can raise our voices and let people know how we feel about it and what the damage will do to our electoral process. We know also that there will be lawsuits probably that come later as well. What the League does is try to stick to, just as Melanie and Vicki mentioned in their program, stick to positive messages. And this year, more than any other year, we need to begin to get those messages out in a way that all members of the legislature hear that. We want to stick to the positive general policy messages that we normally have. And we want to be clear that election integrity is at the heart of all of our positions, and it has always been at the heart of our positions. We want to also always emphasize at the beginning, the middle, and the end that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. And we are trying to make sure that every individual, regardless of what their positions are, have the opportunity to vote and participate in their democracy. Next slide. The other thing that we do want to talk about briefly is that we must conduct our business this session with a lot of compassion and empathy. There are many people that are in the Capitol building, members of the legislature, and certainly many of their staff members who really don't want to be there. They feel the danger that they feel is real, that they are exposed to people who aren't wearing masks. They're in spaces that are closed spaces. And we really need to be appreciative every time we talk with anybody in the Capitol building and express our appreciation for their services. Similar to the election officials who conducted our elections last fall, they were real heroes. And the legislative staff and the members themselves also should be receiving our appreciation for their service. And the other thing that we've been talking with other organizations about and with members of staff is that every office is going to be handled differently. Some offices will perhaps accept some visits in person. Most all of them don't want to see anybody in person. Some prefer Zoom calls. Some will do appreciate your contacting them by written word so that they can easily sort out your input. We know also that the two houses, just like they are all the time, don't agree on exactly how they're going to be handling things. I've put your rules up here in front of you on the Capitol building access itself. The Capitol is open from 9 to 6. That's a big change, and closed for weekends for cleaning. Public entry only through that north door after a recommended optional COVID-19 test. And I should also say that these rules and any other rules that you hear are certainly open to being changed during the session, just like they have been thus far. Members haven't spent a lot of time in the Capitol so far. This last week, they've been gone a number of days. They're convening next Tuesday, and we don't know for how long that will take place. So we just have to stay on top of things, monitor things, and share information. I know I'm not going directly into the building until I get a vaccine, and who knows when that may be. I certainly meet a couple of the categories. We do believe that the House may allow written comments to be placed into the record. That doesn't mean that members are going to be reading those comments. And that's why we all have to reach out to our legislators and make sure that they hear them from us and have that personal contact. The Senate has said that they will not be hearing virtual testimony. However, so far, all the redistricting committees work in the Senate, and the Finance Committee in the Senate is hearing virtual testimony almost throughout the month of February and into March. We want to be respectful of the members' time and their staff's time, because they're receiving contact from all those people who normally would be walking the floor on a regular basis, not just on a lobby day. And if they agree to participate with you, you need to make sure that you are very respectful of their time. Next slide, please. Especially as we begin the session, we want to make sure that all of our members are familiar with our top line positions. For several sessions now, our top priority bill advocacy has been to secure electronic voter registration. We know that that would drastically improve the safety and accuracy and security of the voter registration rolls, and also happens to cost a lot less money. We also are very committed to improving election cybersecurity, which is a direct link to the integrity of our voting process. We have for many months now, several sessions now, had this as one of our key advocacy points. It includes a lot more training for election officials and following the advice of election cybersecurity experts, having audits of their processes and so forth. We speak with one voice on these positions. We have our one-page action paper that is on our website. You've seen it, I'm sure, many times, and it gives you a one-page summary that you can share with your membership as well as others. Our key goal is making voting more understandable to people. When people better understand the process, there's less opportunity for them to make accidental errors. But I also want to say, now is really not the time to get into the specific bills, but to pass on these positive things that we'd like to achieve during this session and beyond. And I've posted up here, I know a number of you have talked about doing Zoom calls as a group with your leagues, or maybe one-on-one with some. This nice photo on this slide is the former president of the Austin League of Women Voters and one of their advocacy leaders speaking with staffers when we used to be able to go and visit in person. But as you conduct those Zoom calls, it would be wonderful for you to do a screen capture and share those photos as well. I think some of the leagues may have already done that, but it's a good opportunity for you to follow up and send them a copy of that and thank them again for their participation, and to keep you and your representative in contact. There's nothing more important than you as a constituent talking to your representatives. Next slide, please. So what we're asking you to do, as Dr. Price and Dr. Defrancesco-Soto, Melanie and Vicky mentioned, is mobilize. And we know that we have the contacts to make that happen. We have the information to provide to you. And we want to start, as we've said, by providing them with our one page so that they know that the things that we have interest in. I should put this on every page and say it every 3 minutes, and that is, we need effective constituent advocacy on positions right now. We need to put before the members of every district that elections are, we know the governor has called them into the emergency list of bills, which means that they can start action quickly, but quickly is sort of relative. We've heard committees are only going to be meeting every other week because there are not enough facilities where they can meet and also be broadcast. And we know that we need to inoculate each of the members with the fact that there are real issues with election processes and there are not issues with election processes. And we want to emphasize the things that could make things better, not worse. Your overture to your state representative and your personal state senator count. And that's what we're talking about doing, is being heard and being on the record, whether it's redistricting or a voting issue or any other issue you care about. But especially as you heard Michael Lee talk about and others refer to, and that as we have to speak up and speak often and keep our positive tone, it doesn't do any good to yell and scream at somebody. We're trying to make things happen. But we're also laying the groundwork, if they don't happen, that we're on the record. I also want you to know that every office for every representative and every senator keeps a record of their constituents who contact them. And they record that by numbers. So we want to make sure that they get a lot of contact on election issues. Even though there is an emergency declaration on the elections bill, we do have a new chair in the House Elections Committee, and we heard yesterday there will be a new committee clerk. So there's some organization that's going to take place, but I'm sure there will be pressure on the committee to move fairly quickly. So it's probably well into March before we'll be asking you to move on specific bills. But we've already put up a non-bill specific action item just for you to use today. I mean, you can use it anytime, but we've put it up to call attention to you today. Our specific action you can take on our Take Action page. And if you haven't gone to visit that, that is a tremendous advancement for us this year, to be able to have the ability to provide you with an up-to-date bill tracking system where you can sort our bills by issues and track those bills that are most important to you, and to see what's happening with those bills as they move forward. Most of them won't. But we also have that system that makes it very easy to reach out to your personal representative. You put your name and address in, and then you're automatically able to send them your message. And those messages do get tracked, as I say. They're easily tracked. The staff can take advantage of that. Our first action call is for you to call attention to what true election integrity is and the need for electronic voter registration and vote by mail improvements. And Janet Imhoff, our Vice President of Advocacy, after I finish our remarks here and after Stephanie Swanson talks about redistricting, Janet is going to go over with you step by step in the process on how very, very easy it is for you to make those comments. Next slide. Some of you are what I see as our special forces group. And that is, if you see your name, if you see your senator or representative's name on this slide, you really need to help us get as much possible contact with them to mobilize everyone in your district to share our overtures on action items before the committee takes up those bills that will be coming out. And we know that there are a lot of new collaborators around the state. We work with a lot of new collaborative statewide organizations, a lot of groups that are representing people who haven't been involved in sessions before, and some who have also worked with us previously in the last session on putting barriers to what was then known as Senate Bill 9, which was the Christmas tree bill that had all the horrible things that could happen, that we were able to work together to put a roadblock in front of, down to the last minutes of the session, that didn't get passed. And those are the types of things that we'll be dealing with during this session. But being positive, we know that we've also encouraged a lot of new election workers that we helped recruit. There are a lot of election protection groups or teams. We have VDR organizations, and then we have the whole panoply of new statewide organizations that represent a whole diverse group of individuals that are concerned about our elections. Next slide. None of the efforts that we've undertaken happen without a lot of sweat and hard work. And I want to give a really special thanks to our League of Women Voters of Texas voting rights team that we have the benefit of this session for the first time. 3 really dedicated people. The first, Susan Schultz, who is also on the state board of directors as their secretary, and Susan Miller, who's recently retired as an attorney with the Texas Attorney General's office, and Karen Phillips, who has worked as a state agency executive too. We're hard at work tracking bills, doing research, and we'll be having testimony drafted. And I want to thank you in advance, because I hope that you will consider yourself a part of the Texas League of Women Voters voting rights team. I know your passion and your firsthand knowledge make your calls to your representatives the very best that we could ask for. So I'll end this here and ask my helper, Sophie, if we have any questions or comments that we want to talk about. Sophie, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do have a question from Jacqueline Kaysen. Would you explain more fully how election cybersecurity programs cost less than what other programs do? What are the monetary savings?
I'm not sure about the monetary savings of cybersecurity. What I was mentioning is that electronic voter registration is very much less expensive because it relies upon the individual who is registering to vote entering their own information. And if you're not aware of the process that's required, currently that is usually filled out in a hard copy. And then the local, the county clerk's office or the county elections administration office have individuals who type in the information from that handwritten card that you use to register with. And that alone is a tremendous expense. There are printing costs, there are all sorts of costs that are related to each county taking care of their own voter registration. I know maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the estimate was just under $3 per registered voter savings. And it's just gotten better and better over the intervening years. At this point in time, 40 other states have electronic voter registration of one sort or the other. Vicki mentioned Arizona. The very first state that had electronic voter registration, online voter registration, was Arizona. And it was not it didn't require legislation. Then Governor Jan Brewer, not a liberal, actually a very conservative Republican, was the one who instituted that. And since that time, 39 other states and the District of Columbia also take advantage of electronic voter registration. So the savings is in people and printing and processing.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Barbara Larkin, and she asked, can you explain the process for how bills move through the House Elections Committee? Are the bills put to a majority vote to decide what moves on?
Yes, and the committee If you want to put that slide up, that might be a good thing to do. The committee this time has a, sorry, backwards. In the House Elections Committee was appointed last week. The chair is Briscoe Kane. And he's from Clear Lake, I think. I don't have my list in front of me. But it also has 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. They don't always vote on party lines. They vote along party lines a good deal of the time. And so once a bill is approved in the House Elections Committee, then it goes to the Calendars Committee. And the Calendars Committee can hold up a bill. That's one of the ways that we were able to deal with Senate Bill 9. The Calendars Committee as well takes a vote on, or their individual members can mark bills not to move forward, and they'd vote and affect whether it goes to the floor or not. The same is the case in the state Senate. The breakdown politically partisan is only 2 Democrats in the Senate State Affairs Committee, which is where most all of the bills go to.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Camille Gaskin, and she is asking if you would please address HB 1026, which seeks to eliminate VDRs.
You know, I'm not conversant on every single bill.
Okay.
We have a lot of really bad bills and we have some really good bills. And I think it's safe to say that on something like 1026, if we see that it's moving forward, we will work very diligently to mobilize everyone who's ever been a VDR, who's thought about being a VDR, because you have stories to tell that your representatives need to hear and the committee needs to hear.
Okay, thank you. And our last question is from Roxana Dean. And she would like to know if a court case changed voter registration and I guess the process of getting a driver's license.
It did, and I'm not sure that I can name the name of the case, but it does mean that individuals who are registered to vote can change their address and register to vote using the Department of Public Safety online system, regardless of what city or community that they live in or are moving to. And that's about the sum of what I can tell you right now. I'm sorry that I'm not conversant on that particular opportunity, but I know that it was a case that involved someone who was unable to register, and now it offers that electronic process to everyone.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. That is all of the questions we have for right now.
Okay. I think that we can move along and take up our next part of this process, which is going to be the amazing, tremendous, hardworking issue chair for redistricting for the league, Stephanie Swanson. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks. Thank you for updating us on elections. I've been watching it very closely with you this past week and this past month. And I think, like Cindy said, and I want to emphasize, we can be the voting rights team, and it is going to be up to us to also monitor and keep track and make sure we're taking those action items when they come in. Without preclearance this time around, making our voices heard through emails, phone calls, Zoom meetings with our legislators and elected officials is going to be the only way that we can help stop some of that bad legislation going through. So thank you for updating us on elections. We appreciate it. Okay, so I am actually going to share my screen if that's okay, because I like to have control and be able to use the pointer and stuff like that. Okay, find my slide first really quick. Oh, no, wrong share. Sorry, it's called share in Zoom. Okay, can everyone, hopefully, there we go. Can everyone see the slides okay?
Good.
Okay, good. Okay, so I am Stephanie Swanson. I am the issue chair of redistricting for the League of Voters of Texas. Thank you all so much for being here today. I want to emphasize that we have our work cut out for us going into this next round of redistricting. As you all have heard in the past, from the past guest speakers, we no longer have preclearance around. And so preclearance was what stopped discriminatory legislation from going into place, including maps. That being said, that's why it is so important for us to realize how important our voices are in this process and to mobilize as much as possible. That is going to be key, even more important in this upcoming legislative session. So I'm going to take you through the process of redistricting and what you can expect over the legislative session. But I also want to give you more of a historical perspective of some of these really big voting rights cases we've seen here in Texas, many of them originating here in Texas, and how they had an impact on overall representation for everyone. Because I think if you look at this whole timeline and perspective, you will see that it's not going to be just one battle. It's going to have to happen over many, many years. And it is very important that we keep this momentum going and that we keep this fight alive and going. Okay, so redistricting is one of the most important processes in our democracy because it determines the power of your vote. It determines how you're represented, which other communities are going to be included in your district, and ultimately who is going to be elected to represent you. That elected official is then going to turn around and make very important decisions about the quality of the air you breathe, the quality of your water, the quality of your child's school, and how much you pay in taxes. These maps are going to be in place for the next 10 years, and it's going to be up to us to tell the House and Senate redistricting committees where our communities are located so they can do a good job of protecting our neighborhoods and keeping them whole in the next round of district maps. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the process. So this whole process, as you all probably know, starts with the census. The census is mandated by our federal constitution. And the reason that the founding fathers actually decided to have a census was to be able to determine the accurate size of our population so they know where to send resources to states, to local municipalities, so on and so forth. This becomes important in redistricting though, because we need to have all of our districts be of the same size. And so one of the questions I always like to ask during these presentations, if we were here in person in a room together, is how many people in here have moved over the past 10 years? Yes, so we like to keep track of when people move so we can equalize those election districts out. As you guys know, there have been delays though because of the COVID pandemic. So now we're looking at a very, very long timeline, and we can expect our maps to be drawn in a special session for sure. So our reapportionment data, reapportionment is where they determine how many congressional seats each state is going to get. And that's based on that census data that comes in. So that reapportionment data is now due at the end of April. So we'll be able to tell by then how many congressional seats we're looking at. And I know the Biden administration is also going to be doing a lot of quality control checks to make sure that the data is accurate to the best of our capability. So let's move on to who is responsible for redistricting here in Texas. And that is the Texas legislator themselves. Elected officials are going to be the people drawing their own election maps. So we have the folks in charge of the hen house. They use partisan gerrymandering right now, and unfortunately racial gerrymandering. We'll go into that in a little bit to draw these district lines. They claim to use partisan gerrymandering, but they use extreme partisan gerrymandering, and that's especially true here in Texas. So they basically draw districts based on who's Democrat, who's Republican. They also can look at voting history. How many times have you voted? How many times have you voted in the primary? And they basically can go block by block and choose their voters. And that's why our district maps look so convoluted and complicated and like a Rorschach test, because they can very, very carefully refine what those districts look like and pick their voters. So it's important to remember that the maps are passed as regular legislation. So that tells you something about the process. Whichever party is in control of the legislator at the time redistricting happens will have an outweighed say in what those maps are going to look like. So right now, conservatives are in control, so we can expect them to gerrymander against Democrats. And I just want to point out that it's been a long history with gerrymandering in Texas. Both Democrats and Republicans have been very guilty over the years. In fact, it was up until the 90s that Democrats heavily gerrymandered against Republicans. In fact, the congressional maps in the 90s that Democrats in Texas drew ranked as some of the worst in US history. So what districts need to get redrawn are US congressional districts, Texas House, Texas Senate, our State Board of Education, everything basically from federal all the way down to local level, county commissioners, city councils, school boards, water boards. So I know this sounds exhausting, but we can do this. we have to be able to advocate throughout all of these different redistricting processes for a fair and open process, and we need to be included in it as much as possible so we get good representation across all levels of government. So I want to give you some big picture ideas for some of the rules that are involved with redistricting. So our federal guidelines, there's a very famous Supreme Court case, Reynolds versus Sims. That's the one person, one vote ruling. And I have a very Texas specific example of why this was so important. So here is some of our election maps from the 1960s. And there's a few different problems that we see that I'm going to point out to this. But if you look at the overall population of all of these districts, so in Harris County, the population was 1.243 million. In Dallas, it was 950,000. And in San Antonio, 687,000. Not only that, but these counties had at-large election systems. So you can see Dallas, you had 9 at-large seats. Houston had 22. Is that right? Wow. No, sorry, that's District 22. Houston had 12 at-large seats, and Bexar County had 7 at-large seats. At-large seats are a way of manipulating people of color's voice in this process. At-large election systems specifically will prevent people of color from being able to hold office. And so the first part of this timeline is this Reynolds versus Sims ruling, the one person, one vote ruling, which got rid of these highly distorted populations in these districts. So that means all of these districts now need to be of equal size. And later on in the 70s, I think it was 73, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, we got rid of multi-member districts as well. So first federal criteria, like I said, is a one person, one vote ruling. Districts need to be the same size. Second one is the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. It said that you can no longer use racial gerrymandering to draw districts, and that was very important. That guideline was a cornerstone of how we got more people of color elected to office. So our communities were represented and our elected officials were reflective of our communities. State guidelines here in Texas, our state constitution says that we have a county line rule. So if you can fit 5 districts in Harris County, for example, that means that all of those 5 districts need to be contained in the county and they cannot cross county line. Texas also has a ban on, like I said, at-large election system. So our Senate districts, all of our districts need to be single member. We also have the backup commission, and the backup commission may come into play this time around, depending on when that census data comes in. This is going to be a legal question mark for when they get called in. The backup commission usually generally gets called in. They can only work on our state legislative maps, and they get called in usually when there's gridlock. That means that the legislator themselves has had time to work on the maps. There's gridlock. They can't pass them out before the end of the legislative session. But because everything is so unusual this year, there's no telling if the backup commission is going to get called in or not. That's going to be probably up to the courts to decide that. But the backup commission consists of Lieutenant Governor, Speaker of the House, the Attorney General, Land Commissioner, and the Comptroller. Right now, those are all currently conservative members of the legislators, so we can kind of see already where that's going. That being said, the legislators themselves don't want to use the backup commission because legislators want to draw their own districts. So there's a lot of moving parts to keep track of, I know. Okay, so I mentioned some of these overarching guidelines that we have to keep track of. So where does this process get gummed up? Where does it start going wrong? And the answer to that is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is redistricting gone wrong. It is a practice of drawing district lines to favor one party or group of people over another. We have 2 types of gerrymandering. We have partisan gerrymandering and we have racial gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering is unfortunately here to stay for a while. The Supreme Court in 2019 said that, you know what, this is too much of a political question. We can't measure how much partisan gerrymandering is too much. So we're not gonna hear any more partisan gerrymandering cases. You guys can use it as much as you want. The other type of gerrymandering that we have is racial gerrymandering, which was outlawed in 1965, as I just said, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The problem with these 2 being in existence still, because yes, the legislators still do use racial gerrymandering, even though it's not allowed, is that race and partisanship go hand in hand, especially in states in the South, especially like states here in Texas. Not 100% all the time, but more than often, they do go hand in hand. So we have our state legislator that says we're going to use partisan gerrymandering, and we're going to heavily partisan gerrymander to our advantage. So our party maintains control of the election process and of the legislature for the next 10 years. But what you see when they do that is the effect of racial gerrymandering, and that can be brought to court, and it is protected under the Voting Rights Act. So if you see heavy partisan gerrymandering used again in this next redistricting cycle, you bet there are going to be voting rights groups stepping in and taking those maps to court. So one of the problems that this creates, this heavy partisan gerrymandering, is that our legislator and our elected officials don't reflect our communities. And so after the 2011 round of redistricting, which, by the way, Texas was the only state in the nation not to gain pre-clearance of their maps back then. There were intentional findings of racial discrimination as well in those maps. And so after that problem that we had in 2011, what you saw is still voters of color were short 5 congressional seats. And like I said, that gap is because of that extreme partisan gerrymandering they chose to use and racial gerrymandering as well. So for our state legislator, this is the part that upsets me considerably, is that all of Texas right now, we have 58% people of color living here. But when you look at the racial and ethnic diversity at the legislature, you only see 36% of our elected officials as people of color. And again, that skew is because of partisan gerrymandering. So I want to give you a quick look at the evolution of voting rights in Texas, because we have some really important cases and it really shows how strong people are here in the state and their ability to mobilize and fight for equal representation. So all of this started actually back in the 1920s. There were several cases that tried to get rid of the all-white primary. And finally, there was a dentist in Houston by the name of Dr. Lonnie Smith. He worked with Thurgood Marshall, and they were able to take a case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they got rid of all-white primaries here in Texas. That being said, even when you got rid of all-white primaries, you did not see an improvement in the amount of people of color that were elected to office. That came about in 1964 with Reynolds versus Sims ruling, the one person, one vote ruling, when all of our districts needed to be of the same size. And then a little bit more with the passage of the Voting Rights Act that outlawed racial gerrymandering. And so here, because of that, actually in Houston, where I'm from, and she was close by to actually where I grew up, you had people like Barbara Jordan, who was then able to get elected to office for the first time. And you did see slowly after that rollout of the Voting Rights Act, more people of color being elected to the legislature. However, the legislators still used, the legislators still used multi-member districts. And multi-member districts, like I said, prevented people of color from getting elected as well. And so finally in 1973, a state legislator brought a case against, I guess he sued the legislator, but the case went all the way to the Supreme Court and we got rid of multi-member districts. All of our districts went to single member here. And these had broad scale implications across the US as well. So it was a very important case. And after that case, you then saw more people of color being elected to office. But I have denoted here on the timeline a red portion and a purple portion. And so the red portion shows that, yes, there is some amount of influence that the legislator used to try to manipulate race. And that was specifically more overt ways of doing it. So they used racial gerrymandering, they used multi-member districts. And then after they outlawed both of those, we see a switch to purple, but now what they're doing is specifically using egregious partisan gerrymandering, and you do have the effects of racial gerrymandering still around. That being said, we still saw more people of color being elected to office than we had in like the 1960s. So we have made improvements, but then in 2013, the Supreme Court decided to gut the Voting Rights Act. And that was a very, very important piece of legislation for Texas specifically. Texas has been found to violate the Voting Rights Act and to intentionally discriminate in their election maps for every decade for the past 50 years. And so if there's one state that needs that pre-clearance supervision, it was specifically Texas. And then I also mentioned that, in 2019, the Supreme Court said that partisan gerrymandering is fine, we're still gonna allow it. And so this has severe consequences for our communities of color here in the state. So we are going to, need to be included in this next upcoming round of redistricting. We need to be the eyes, we need to be the ears, and we need to be advocating for a fair and open process. So we can have elected officials that look like our communities. Okay, so I just touched on this. We're not going to have any pre-clearance. So like I said, up to us, we really need to do a great job of showing up, providing testimony, advocating for that fair and open process. In 2019, a federal district court considered putting the state back under pre-clearance for their 2011 round of redistricting that ended up having multiple findings of intentional discrimination. Ultimately, though, that federal court said, we can't do that right now because of what this recent Supreme Court ruling said. And so instead, we're going to give you a very stern warning. And the judge specifically said, we want you to have a fair and open process. We want you to commit to having a fair and open process this next time around. And that fair and open process looks much like legislation that we would see for an independent redistricting commission. It merely dictates specific timelines and procedures that the legislator must use to draw the next round of district maps. And so that's what we are going to be advocating for. when we go and speak with legislators, there's going to be two things. We're going to do the fair and open process, but then we're also going to be advocating for reforms as well. And that will be the next few slides. But fair and open process is a must. And the more that we can have folks come up and echo these advocacy points, the better off we'll be. We'll have more evidence as we move into future litigation, if it comes to that, to show that, hey, no, Texans were involved in this process. They were demanding a fair process. We watched what happened in 2011. We've learned from those mistakes. It's up to you now to implement what a federal district court said. And that's one of our benefits that we have going into this session. So we can use that federal court's ruling a little bit as leverage, right? At least the judge's comments. So here are those advocacy points. We want to hold public input hearings after the census data is delivered to the state. So right now the Senate is holding public input hearings, partly because we have called them out on it so much because they were supposed to be doing it during the interim. That wasn't going to happen because of the COVID pandemic. And they said that their House rules and Senate rules were too complicated that they couldn't hold virtual hearings during the interim session. We pushed and pushed and pushed. And so finally, because of our advocacy efforts and because they need to hold these public hearings as evidence for future litigation to show that they did try to include the public to a certain extent, they, specifically the Senate Redistricting Committee, has decided to hold virtual public input hearings. And so that was a lot of work on our advocacy team's effort, on our part, to get those virtual hearings set up. And the Senate Redistricting Committee is actually the only committee in all of the legislature that is doing this. That being said, what that federal judge said that considered bail-in, putting the state back under preclearance, was you need to hold these hearings after the census data comes in. It doesn't make much sense for you to be doing that right now. We don't know where these population changes are occurring. You don't have the data in hand. So we have no guarantee or any expectation that they are going to be able to take the public input they're collecting now and make the maps reflect what the public is saying. So that's the first thing. We want them to hold a public input hearing after the census data is delivered to the states. We also want to allow for virtual committee hearings throughout the entire legislative session. I am particularly upset that the entire legislature will not be holding virtual hearings, especially when it comes to the redistricting process, because it is such a vital part of the functioning of our legislature. So the fact that they have chosen to exclude the public, even during a pandemic, is not, it's not acceptable in my opinion. So all of our advocacy groups in the Fair Texas Coalition highly support increasing that virtual committee hearing process throughout the entire legislative process. We also want to provide at least 14 days to review the maps. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of very difficult math to go on that goes on behind determining if they violated the Voting Rights Act. Not only that, but we need time, our community needs time to review the maps, to mobilize people, alert them that, hey, you have a chance now to review it and provide comment to the legislator. So we've asked for those 14 days, they did not give it to us. So we need to be asking that when we meet with our elected officials. Another thing that we need to be asking for is we want them to provide 5 days to review any amendments, any changes that they make to the maps. Again, because there's a lot of that tricky math. We want to be able to mobilize the correct communities if those changes impact our communities. We also want them to provide an analysis of how the new maps impact historically disenfranchised communities. We also want them to keep all of their documents, written communications, emails, and text messages, so on and so forth. The reason for that is because of litigation. And so the former chairman of the House Redistricting Committee, Chairman King, Phil King, from the Weatherford area, was also the former national chairman of ALEC. ALEC stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. They're very conservative leaning, and they claim to represent the needs of the business community. They had their national conference here back in 2019 here in Austin, and Chairman King was on their redistricting panel, because yes, they do track redistricting because it determines how much control they will have in different states. So on that redistricting panel, they were telling people to, at the end of the day, delete their emails, destroy their hard drives, destroy the evidence. And so we need to be vocal about that. And hopefully not everyone at the legislature will be doing that. Hopefully if they have some sort of scheme like that, hopefully people will be truthful during the deposition process. Okay, so it's important while we echo these fair and open campaign points to our elected officials that we also ask for them to implement some sort of reform. It's important not only to get the league's position across, but it's also important that we show to, again, if litigation arises, we show the court that, hey, we were here the whole time telling them, no, look at the mistakes you're making. We're telling you how to fix the process, right? So we can do that supporting our legislation that we support for an independent redistricting commission or any other commission for that much. And I've listed the bill numbers here that have already been filed. We're going to be honest, I'm going to be brutally honest with you right now. We're not going to get any reforms passed this session because the governor is the person that has to sign off on this legislation. And he's not going to do that when it comes to redistricting. He's not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. It's important though that we still get our advocacy positions across for the bills that we support, but also, like I said, so we have proof if litigation arises that, we're trying to tell them, you need to improve this process. One of the major bills that we are working to file right now is with Representative Jessica Gonzalez, and it's not filed yet, but it was one that we filed last session. And this is just a very simple bill to improve the redistricting process and make it more transparent and open. So it would require the legislator to hold 5 public input hearings after the census data comes in, create an online portal for maps and data to close data sources, and just set up a timeline, a very laid out timeline for them to work around. One other bill that you can mention is one from Representative Dutton in the Houston area, and that's going to end prison gerrymandering. Right now, they're counting incarcerated individuals in the districts where they're in prison instead of counting them at their home district, and that does affect representation. We'll be having a call to action on that over the next month, so please keep an eye out for the action alerts. And the last thing I quickly wanted to go through is, because I think I'm over on time, is our action alerts. This is how you can take action right now. So besides meeting with your legislators, or when you go to meet with your legislators, I should say, please take the action paper with you. That will kind of hopefully give you some talking points to discuss with them. It's got the fair and open campaign on there. It's got some of the history from the legal cases over the past 10 years. And it has our position. We support an independent redistricting commission. We'll be having multiple action alerts throughout the legislative session on the redistricting process. There's one up right now, and Janet's going to show you how to send that off to your legislators in the next section. Definitely participate in the Senate's virtual public input hearings that are going on right now. I've listed the schedule here. I've also listed instructions on how to register for those hearings, and we'll try to have another testimony refresher for those that want to get some more guidance on how to prepare testimony. I've also listed testimony guides just in case. And one quick announcement, the National League, which I didn't start this off with, even though I had the logo up, we have our People Powered Fair Maps initiative. It's at the national level with our League of Women Voters US. Each state has a different plan that we're going to be rolling out. And so in Texas, we're going to create, hopefully, if the league has capacity, a new position at the local level called the Local League Redistricting Chair. We can change the name if you guys don't want to use that. Up for discussion. We need folks at the local level helping on the redistricting process. And we're going to be forming subcommittees so folks can, do presentations, advocate for fair maps at the local level, map out communities of interest, which is going to be our top priority as we move into that work. So if you are interested in doing that work with the league, please reach out to your president and have your president reach out to me, and I can get everyone plugged in with that work. Yeah, and that's it. Sorry if I went over. Based on time, do we want to just skip the question and answer and go to Janet so we can get everyone out?
I think we should take a couple of the questions. I looked at them in the question box, and I think they're very appropriate. Could we go ahead and take a couple of questions at least?
Okay, the first one, can y'all hear me? The first question from Mary Koch, explain more fully the county line rule. And she goes on to say that Senator Huffman, her senator, represents parts of Brazoria, Fort Bend, and part of Harris County. There's no identifiable community of interest.
Yeah, and so that's a problem with partisan gerrymandering. So that county line rule only applies to the House districts. So that's why you see less gerrymandering going on in the House districts, to be honest with you. So when they look at the total population of Travis County, they look at how many districts, because each district has to be the same population. So they look to see how many districts they can then fit in Travis County. And if what the county line rule says is you have to stay in the county and not cross county line if the population permits it, basically. I hope that makes sense. So for our Senate and congressional districts, there is no county line rule. And so as a result of that, you see very large, expansive districts that go for sometimes hundreds of miles across the state.
Okay, next question. Is anyone working on an amendment to the Texas Constitution to prevent gerrymandering?
Those were on the reforms that I just listed. So these are so that's a good point. So SJR stands for Senate Joint Resolution. HJR stands for House Joint Resolution. Those joint resolutions are considered constitutional amendments, and you'll always see them filed with enabling legislation. Even though our Constitution is 500 pages long or something like that, ridiculous, they always try to minimize the amount of stuff that they have to put in the Constitution. So that's why you see the enabling legislation that goes with it. So all of the bills that I've listed up here are those reforms for commission, like an independent commission of some sort, where you take the power away from the legislator to draw their own election maps and you give it to some sort of independent body. Nonpartisan body is what we would prefer to see.
Okay, I think that we better move on to Janet. We do have some more questions, but thank you.
Hey, wait, Janet, you're on mute. There you go.
No, thank you. I'm Janet Imhoff, Advocacy Chair for League of Women Voters of Texas, and I have the privilege of showing you our new Take Action page on our website. And so I'm going to ask Sophie to share her screen and we'll walk through it quickly, but there are so many options that I want you to know about. It's a wonderful tool. This is our home screen for League of Women Voters of Texas at lwv.org/Texas. And Sophie is going to click on Advocacy and Issues, which is the second one down there on the left screen. And under Advocacy and Issues, still in the left column, there's the Take Action page, and you'll go to Take Action. This is our action page. And across the top, you see 4 choices: home, elected officials, bills, and media. The home page is our priority actions page. These are the action alerts that are active right now and are available for you to send. The first one is we need improvements for voter registration and vote by mail. This is brand new. This is what Cinde was talking about. This is the one that has been written by our issue chair, Cinde Weatherby, highlighting the 2 things we need most right now and asking you to notify or send a letter requesting this to your senator and representative. The next one down is our fair and open redistricting action. It's been up a long time. Look how many have been sent already, 16,396. Amazing. The next one down is allow safe public testimony, in which we are asking the legislature to allow more virtual testimony than they are currently allowing. Allow it to the various committees. The fourth one down is our time to expand Medicaid action alert. And we've had quite a few of those sent out. This has been up a week or a week and a half. At the bottom, you see contact your elected officials. Let's click on take action under time to expand Medicaid. Thank you, Sophie. If you click take action and enter your street address, or if you're a league member, your street address will automatically come up, and then click go. It'll take you to the full version of the action alert that has, well, right now we don't have the contact information in it, but it has more information about the action alert. It has, well, go back up, please, just a little bit. There, okay. I guess we have clicked on take action. Oh, learn more, click on learn more, that's it. Okay, this has a fuller explanation of why Texas needs expanded Medicare. And that's for your information. So when you talk to your legislator, you know what the various information that will back up your claim. Go back up, please. And then when you click on take action to any of the action alerts, you will see the letter that we have pre-written for you to send to the legislator about this. Then this is the letter that would go out about expanding Medicaid. If you don't want to send a pre-written letter, if you want to write your own letter, you can use the information. Go back up to home. There we go. All right, scroll all the way down to the bottom. This is where you can write your own letter in your own words, right here. Contact your elected officials about an issue that's important to you. And in this, you would also enter your street address, your zip code, click go, and it takes you to a page that shows all your elected officials from federal down to local. Just keep going down. There we go. There's the city council for Austin. You fill in the topic, the subject, you write your own letter in this box. It's quite amazing. And go back up just a little bit. There, the either send or print and mail box is what you do after you've written your letter. If you send it, it just goes right out electronically to their office. You do need to decide which person you're going to send your letter to. In this case, you need to unclick those that you would not see your letter. You just want expanding Medicaid, for instance, to go to your state officials. But you also have the option under send to print and mail. If you want a copy of the letter you sent, you click the print and it'll go to your printer and print you a copy, and you can either mail it by snail mail or you can come back to this screen and click send and it'll go out both ways, but you've saved yourself a copy. Okay, now, so if you go to elected officials across the top, great. This is another one. If you're a league member, your address will automatically be in here, but anyone can use it. You enter your street address. It shows all your elected officials. When you click go, starting with federal level and then down to state level, and you notice each box has an option, send a message, local officials. And if you need more information, you can enter, find your elected officials, go back up to the top. Okay, elected officials, okay. Go back, click on elected officials again. There at the top. Okay, and you see the browse by state option. This is truly amazing. If you click on Texas, you get everyone who's elected in Texas. You see the complete members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Go on down. And each of those links is live. You can contact their office directly from this software. And then the state executives. The state Senate members, you can click on view members, don't do it yet, and you see the entire state Senate of Texas, or you can click on State House, view the entire membership. You can view all the committees of the Senate and House by clicking on the committees. It is an amazing tool, and as you know, the committee chairs for the State House weren't chosen until this week, and they're already on this software. So go back up to the top and we will go to the third link. Okay, bills. We've got numerous bills. We could scroll down and it just goes on and on. These are bills that have been filed mainly in voting rights and election laws in 2021. And they're just, you can click on each link and read the bill, see who's sponsoring it, who filed it, that sort of thing. Go back up to the top where it says sort by. Click on sort by for me. Good. Right now we're in year, but you can also sort by category. Try that, Sophie. Right. And this puts the bills into categories. For instance, ballot by mail. And there's a lot of those. If we scroll down, we could see another category. I'm going to let it go kind of fast. I know that's hard to look at. But I just wanted to show you that there is another category down there. Yes, election dates. And there are several categories, including redistricting. Several redistricting bills are included in this category 1, where you can go direct to the bill, look at it yourself, see who filed it, everything like that. All right, go back on up to the top. And this is the last link in our software, which is a truly amazing area, media. There. This is a link where you can write your own letter to the editor, your own. You would fill in your zip code and good. Click go and it will show you the media in your area. And this is not just the media in your zip code. For instance, I put in my zip code last week and I got about 25 options that cover 4 counties. So it can be quite extensive, the media in your area. In order to send a letter to the editor, you would need to, and don't do it right now, but you would need to click on at least one of them or more and click send a message and a box will open up where you can write your own letter to the editor. Okay, go back up to the top, click on media again. We get another browse by state option. If you click on Texas, you get practically all the media in the entire state. Or you could click on other states and get the media in other states. If you wanted to send a letter to Houston from your area, if you wanted to send a letter to Amarillo, you have the option. You would click on one of those and the box would open up where you could write your own letter to the editor. So these are the numerous ways that all of you, this is members and non-members, have access to this website, can write their own letters, can act on one of our action alerts, can write a letter to the editor. Truly amazing. And combined with our information that's available both on this website through our action papers, which are listed under advocacy in the left column. You would just get to the advocacy page and scroll down and you can get all the action papers that have been written so far. You can go to the priority issue page, the redistricting page, and see what Cinde and Stephanie have written about what's going on right now. And their issue update boxes are updated frequently. And then if you click on all issues, you can go to any one of our 26 issues that we follow in the legislature. If you just scroll down just a bit, keep going down, there. Those are all the issues that we follow. We have issue chairs for almost all of them. They write on their page what is important, what bills might be important, what's going on in the legislature or in the culture concerning their area. They have pretty wide-ranging opportunities on what they want to write on their issue page. So I urge you to go to advocacy and find out what's going on in the issues that you're interested in. But of course, we're really emphasizing voting rights and redistricting. We do have 3 other urgent issues that received a lot of attention from members when we were asking them to choose our priority issues. And those other 3, if you'd scroll up just a little bit, there. The urgent issues are air quality, climate change, healthcare in general, but our issue focuses on low income and elderly. We also cover child health and behavioral health and women's health, which we have focused on a lot in the last few years. Those are still our urgent issues. So just wanted to call your attention to that. Thank you, Sophie. If you would leave that and go back to the slideshow. I think it's number 21. And just one last thing I want to tell you about what we're asking local leagues to do now. All of you, or many local leagues, have contacted your legislators, interviewed them on their priorities. Now we want you to recontact them and talk to them about our priorities. Talk to them about what we need in redistricting and in voting rights, especially right now. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, set up an interview. It can be a Zoom interview like most of you did before for your legislative interviews. And I really think that the legislators are enjoying the Zoom. They can see you. It's a back and forth conversation. Usually a small team, 4 or 5 members from a local league will talk to a senator or representative. But if they don't want to or don't have time for a Zoom, maybe they'll take a phone call. If they won't take a phone call, send a letter. We want you to recontact your senator and your representative now about our priority issues, voting rights and redistricting. Okay, I think that about covers it for me. I think I'll pass it off now to Grace, who will have some final comments.
Okay. There I am. Okay, that was fantastic. We've learned so much today, and I'm so very happy that you guys could be here today. I hope you learned a lot and that you're inspired to take action. We'll send out a follow-up survey to find out what your feelings are, what your thoughts are on the webinar that we provided today. We want to get your feedback on it. Please take action. Take action as an individual. Take action with the league. Do not think that this legislative session is incredibly important with the voting rights and redistricting out there. We have got to be an active force, even though COVID is on. And that's why we provide these wonderful tools and information for you guys to use to make an impact with your legislatures. So thank you so much. Not only the league members, but the other folks on the call who are not league members. We welcome you to use this. And if you're inspired to join the league, then even better. That is fantastic. So we're very happy that everybody joined to fight for voting rights in a fair redistricting process. And thank you for standing up with the league to empower voters and defend democracy here in Texas. It's needed now more than ever. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.